Next part of the program called Setting the Stage, the Current State of Mobility Data. And we're really thrilled to have our next speaker, Tyler Duvall, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of Cavnu. Now, Cavnu is a company focused on accelerating the full potential of connected and autonomous vehicles to make roads safer, less congested, shared, and sustainable. Before joining Cavnu, Tyler was CEO of SH-130 concession company in Central Texas, and prior to that, he was a principal at McKinsey & Company, where he advised a wide variety of private and public sector entities on strategic, operational, and organizational topics. Tyler also served in several roles in the U.S. Department of Transportation, including as acting undersecretary for policy, the agency's third highest ranking official. He led the department's efforts to modernize transportation infrastructure through new procurement, technology, and financing approaches. He earned a BA in economics from Washington Lee University and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And I'll just say, Tyler, when I was, again, the old war story, when I was at DOT, I only knew you by name at first because every time there was some sort of intractable problem or we needed some policy thinking, there's a button, I think, said someone get Tyler Duvall on the line to help think this through. So we're thrilled you could be here and share your thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Errol. That's way too kind. Usually it's said the other way, which is anytime there's an intractable problem, blame Tyler Duvall at the department. Yeah, exactly. So first of all, thanks. Great to be here. Beautiful offices. DC native, so it's fun to be back here in town. I live in Alexandria, but good to actually have to drive in to the city. So, real quickly on our company, it was basically formed almost 3 years ago now. It's a joint venture of Google and Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, and then Ford made a major investment in the company along with a large trucking company called Landstar, and then a large European road operator called Global Via. So there's basically 5 different strategic investors, all effectively aligned on this problem statement that as the vehicles that you all work with every day, this advanced vehicle industry, both in trucking and passenger car, starts to really get scaled deployment, that the challenge of the operating environment on roadways has gotten no attention at all from policymakers, including the U.S. Department of Transportation, if I'm being brutally honest. And so as a result, we said, look, there's 3 major challenges that these vehicles face. Obviously, data insufficiency is one of the core challenges, and you can see what you can see and you can share what you can share, but if nobody's helping these vehicles with additional information around roadway conditions, roadway operations, then they're always going to have some performance degradation that could otherwise be achieved. And we always are very clear that we're not a necessary item. Every vehicle that's advanced has to have its own safety case, but we want that vehicle to be operating in an optimized way as much as possible. Almost all the time is the way we talk about it, but also the way roadways are designed and configured as well as daily operated presents huge challenges to advanced vehicles. So that's the problem statement where, folks who live in the DC area and use managed lanes around here are operated by a company called Transurban and Sintra on I-66, 495, and 95. We're kind of the next generation version of that business model, full integration. But also I'll talk a little bit about the data model, and we want to fund these roadways up front. We want to run them, so heavy CapEx investment, but then effectively to support the business models of everybody in this room. And the way we think about the data is there's effectively observations of the world state. So our hardware platform is 2 cameras, a radar. We will use a C-V2X platform in our Ford demonstration in Michigan. We're at the test track right now with Ford in Romeo, Michigan, and we're going to deploy on Interstate 94 later this year. But it's observe everything happening. We call it world state. We basically built a digital twin of the existing roadway environment, capturing everything that's happening, and then providing inferences effectively around that. So, debris in the roadway, this kind of debris, this kind of problem on the road, you've got a stalled vehicle beyond your line of sight from your perception stack, effectively capture that, provide inferences around that, and then ultimately advise vehicles. And the advise part is obviously where you get in a lot of sensitivities. We do not want to be effectively changing the way vehicles are manufactured. We certainly don't want to be changing the way they ingest data. And we're pretty agnostic. If C-V2X ends up being the platform that takes off, great. We can deliver data through that platform. If it's a more advanced vehicle like an L4 trucking company, we're largely going to be in a higher latency environment. So it's a cloud to cloud type communication. half a mile, 2 miles up the road kind of information, not as instantaneous as potentially a level 3, which is what we're partnering with Ford on, is really testing some of the level 3 features. So I think, our data is effectively the crown jewel asset of the company. And when we looked at the data landscape for transportation companies, we see lots of bespoke data. We see obviously some interesting CCTV feeds around intersections. I used to run a toll road in Austin, Texas, and around the toll booths we had cameras. We were capturing lots of things happening, doing virtually nothing with the data. So there's lots of data being collected by government agencies. Lots of data obviously being used by the companies that you all work with every day to enhance your own vehicle systems, but nobody really pulling it together and providing this integrated view of like what's happening and what you should do about it. And so I would just characterize the current set of data as lots of it, and very underutilized. We did when I was at McKinsey, I can say this publicly because I think it was a public sector client. I can't usually talk about it, but we did a piece of work for the National Weather Service to really look at the role of private weather data across all areas. But what was interesting is transportation ended up being the most interesting for particularly micro weather forecasts, and the airline industry is now extensively using micro weather from third-party data. We think the auto industry will start to use that as well. As you see weather patterns like dramatically different in, take the area of Michigan where we're working between Detroit and Ann Arbor. Every day you're getting incredibly diverse, complex micro weather events, even on Interstate 94. So mile marker 22, weather is this. 26, it's different. And I think that, our system effectively will be able to capture these micro differences in operating environments. And I think today, nobody's taking that holistic view. Everyone's going to government and, selling a data feed, selling, hey, here's some observations. And there's kind of two kinds of data sets that we're witnessing that we want to effectively provide both. But again, with the purpose of facilitating your industry. And in fact, one is, I call strategic data. This is used by planners, long-term horizon, looking at traffic flows, looking at behavioral patterns on roadways, trying to understand demand. Demand forecasting, by the way, is one of the most complicating things in all of transportation. Bill Gates was kind of a transportation geek back in the day, and they capitalized a company out of Microsoft's R&D unit called INRIX, which you probably many of you heard of. But that was literally hey, this is really cool and complicated to figure out what's happening with demand on roadways. And so they were way ahead of the curve. I remember when I was in government, we met with them in like 2003, and I was like, wow, this is kind of the new frontier of like capturing what's happening. That's largely used for, like I said, planning, like where should highways go. There's an intermediate level of strategic stuff that's basically much nearer term, which is what interventions can we make on the roadway today, operational interventions, et cetera, but really more to manage demand more efficiently. So like ramp metering that you see on some of these roadways, all of that's basically data that was collected over years and years of understanding the way flow conditions on highways can improve throughput. That was a data assessment by economists and urban planners that effectively propelled a policy change in how we manage vehicles' access onto roadways. So that data set, call it more strategic around how to manage it. And then there's just the daily operational, how to run a roadway efficiently. And that piece we think is highly challenging for a lot of vehicles. I mean, I was driving literally on 94 yesterday. I was in Lansing and driving back to the airport in Detroit. And I mean, the debris on the left side of the interstate, I mean, it was everywhere. And, there's just not this operational mindset. So, our system will capture that, we'll remove it, and we'll run the roadway, frankly, the way it should be run, which is extremely well maintained, high quality, high fidelity information around the characteristics of the roadway being provided in real time for vehicles that can absorb it. And I think we just think that's a different business model than, again, selling a bespoke set of data. We effectively will partner with firms that have, so take weather. If you've got a company that's got a great third-party micro weather capability, we would effectively bolt that onto our platform. So it's an integration play and saying, like, as the world understands the environment better and better over time, let's synthesize it and effectively provide it in a way that vehicles can take that in. Just real quick, 3 examples of just obvious benefits. So, and this is the 2021 Federal Highway Study, and we've actually seen some evidence already from our OEM partner on some of this. But so CACC, effectively, if you can get some cooperative adaptive cruise control benefits, it's a 35% reduction in the travel time delays at a bottleneck. Think about the throughput benefits of effectively a more efficient cruise control system on the roadway. Second one was just speed advisory and reducing hard braking. 20% CO2 emission reductions from that kind of benefit. I mean, these are like huge public benefits. Third one is just lane capacity. So obviously the spatial separation of vehicles, like the rough math is that you get about 1,900, 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. When you get past that point, you have this tipping point problem that everyone experiences every day in Washington, where effective capacity goes down to like 700, 800, 900. So if you get on the Beltway or 95 this afternoon, the lane capacity at 4 o'clock in the afternoon will be about 800 or 900 vehicles. At 2 in the morning, it'll be about 2,000 vehicles. If you can effectively control spatial separation between those vehicles, you can effectively get closer and closer to 3,000, 4,000. So you're kind of doubling the highway capacity by just better management of that. And that's a data problem. So I think my general view is data is going to unlock all kinds of innovations. Our first business model is really around the controlled operating environment and simplifying it, effectively taking the lessons learned from mines in Australia and what the DoD has done in the Middle East and all these kind of agriculture, these controlled operating environments, so that vehicles are not having to map everything all the time, which we know is expensive. Control that environment. But the next iteration of our business is effectively a broadcast of world state situation on every roadway, largely limited access highways in the near term, but ultimately every roadway. And look, our hardware platform is every 200 meters. We're going to probably extend that to 500 or 600 as the camera technology improves, and it'll get cheaper and cheaper to provide that data. That's the goal, is to kind of bend the data cost curve, but also provide more value. So this is a big inflection point in transportation around data. Your companies, or the companies that are represented and are working with the lawyers in this room, are using data in incredible ways to optimize your existing platforms, but no one's really helping you, or frankly, the DOTs and this is not a dig at the DOTs, because it's not really their business model. Their business model is really to effectively, build roadways, design roadways, protect roadways from environmental impacts. And ultimately, they just haven't built the apparatus inside government to provide this kind of data to your vehicles. And I'll be blunt, the auto industry and the trucking industry have not engaged with government, largely because they see government as kind of an impenetrable, that's government. I don't want to deal with them. But, we joke at Cavenue about the reason the interstate system looks the way it does is because, General Motors and Ford decided in 1939 that the interstate system should look like this. So we're kind of at a new point where what we love for the auto industry and the trucking industry to do is define a set of data requirements for their own vehicles beyond what they can see today, work with companies like ours and others to basically set a data construct for government and say to government, you should be collecting this data, distributing it in this form, and let us then figure out the ways to ingest it and optimize. So that's kind of where we are. I think, obviously, like I said, lots of data out there. I think two big problems. It's not getting aggregated in an efficient way. And then lastly, secondly, it's not getting distributed to these companies to do anything with it. So lots of excitement. So, we're under punching our weight largely. And I think for the United States, we're not going to have, you probably heard it from Vin, you're not going to have a top-down mandate. You're not going to have the federal government dictate to state and local governments. What's cool about the United States is the inverse of that is you got lots of state and local governments that can do whatever they want. So we've got contracts now in San Diego, in Texas, in Michigan, soon to be 3 other big southern states. And all of these governments are wrestling with, how do we optimize existing capacity more efficiently? I will say very few of them understand the challenges of your business. And we have become kind of like a broker to explain some of the core challenges that would help vehicles perform better. But it is a gap. Maybe Venable can establish a state and local group to basically help communicate that stuff. But let me pause and see if there are any questions. Yeah.
Just say who you are. Sure. Hi, Daniel Silverberg with Capstone, formerly with Steny Hoyer.
Oh, yeah. Great. I'm a Maryland native.
I like you all the more.
Yeah. I crossed the river, full disclosure.
What do you see as the biggest technological obstacle to achieving that end state that you described?
It's funny you say. So when we started the company, our biggest challenge was hiring, but we're not cracking fusion. I mean, we're basically, we've got a really great machine learning team, including a number out of GM and Ford. We've got a great software team that's, out of the biggest L4 companies. Our head of technology was the head of software engineering for Aurora. So we've hired extensively out of the L4 and L3 world. They feel quite confident that it's really just building the digital twin, providing, reality on the ground, matching the hardware plan, what cameras do we need? We decided on cameras and radar. Others have other solutions, but that's going to work. We feel quite confident now after a year and a half of streaming data off roadways that it's actually not a technical challenge. Ultimately, it's really going to be how do we get governments to agree to provide this platform for companies like ours to develop this feed, and then which companies can compete to provide that information in a format that the vehicles represented here can actually ingest them, lower and lower latency over time, but initially obviously at higher. So I actually, it's funny, I was, I'm a policy person, economics training, finance, legal, and I ran a road. But when I started the company, I had huge anxiety about the complexity of the software challenge that I thought we were going to be embarking on. 3 years in now, I'm like, okay, I see that this is quite feasible. This is not, we're not looking to create the next Chat GPT, for 20 years of development. We are effectively taking tried and true practices around a digital twin, which, by the way, is being used now in construction environments everywhere. I mean, this concept of a digital environment to replicate the real world, everybody's doing that. So it's a lot of everybody's doing it, but nobody's integrating it and no one's providing it. That's kind of where we are. So.
So as we move forward in the day, we're going to talk about privacy, in particular, managing collection, sharing, and use of the data. Can you talk from your perspective, Tyler, about all of that, all of those data sets? They're going to be used for these important purposes, but from your perspective, how do you address the privacy challenges?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question. So when we pushed our legislation, we got legislation in Michigan last year through the state legislature, first of its kind, state effectively creating a platform for advanced vehicle laneways. The trial lawyers and the Teamsters focus obviously on, are you kicking drivers out of trucks or facilitating that process, and trial lawyers focused on, like, can they get access to the stream, so to speak. When I ran my road in Texas, we had probably 5 or 6 lawsuits related to wrongful death, accidents and crashes on the roadway. We had a policy there of effectively 1-day retention. Most toll road operators have similar policies around retention. Government, ours is even less. We don't need any personal information. We don't need license plate data. We obviously don't need any information about who's in the vehicle or anything like that. This is, like I said, a world state. We need to classify whether it's a truck, what kind of truck, whether it's a car, what kind of car, what the speed is, the way it's operating. But, as a PII matter, we basically designing the platform to not collect any information about that. Now, people may say even that information is, vehicle operations and the police ultimately will be the enforcer of the laneway, but that's going to be largely from a traditional speed limit and then toll collection basis. So, we do need to link an account at some point. And ultimately our goal is the state of Michigan will actually handle enforcement, that will effectively, there'll be a tolling platform that's separate from the core system that will effectively administer the charging for use of the roadway. And that will be a very limited feed and just literally capture an image and send it. So the road I used to run in Texas, we literally would capture the license plate, send it to the state of Texas, and we're not involved in it. The state of Texas administers that. So I think the other big question is storage of data. I think generally speaking, we're using the data to train our models. So we stream right now on 96 in Michigan. We've got cameras up there right now, streaming data to effectively train models. We are storing that right now, largely just because we want our models to get more and more robust. But once we have more roadways, I don't anticipate us storing much of anything. Models will be, fully trained at that point. And then we're building an entire simulation platform that we're going to hopefully be able to partner with different automakers on to effectively replicate the CAV environment for their vehicles and to see how performance works. That sim environment, hopefully nobody is going to be concerned about that data because it's not real data. So it's a great question, Ariel. I think, what's interesting is when we started the company, we had a head of machine learning who was an incredibly smart guy, had a very strong theory that the best revenue generator for our company was going to be effectively selling this data right to vehicle manufacturers. I think that was wrong. ultimately, that's not the business we want to be in anyway. Lots of questions around monetizing public data. We'd rather sell a service on the roadway, which is a better driving experience that effectively facilitates what these companies, what you all are making. So, long-winded answer, but I think PII is in our world is not going to be an issue. But I could see the bigger thing I think is going to be the trial lawyers who say, we want to effectively bring. I mean, that's the single biggest. I think 50% of plaintiffs' lawsuits is that right? Are traffic related. That's a stat I heard recently. Sorry for the trial lawyers in the room, but that is the one area where a road operator like us, a private road operator who doesn't have sovereign immunity and under contract has some exposure, we'll have to have a pretty rock solid retention strategy. So. Hey, Tom.
Question for you. You touched on a lot of it. What's your kind of view of all right now? Just on automation.
Yeah.
Side,
Look, yeah. So we have three products, so to speak. One is a limited access roadway, kind of like a next generation managed lane, like you see here in DC, and that's what the Michigan project is. That's largely an unlock to level 3. We're very bullish on level 3. We actually had a debate inside our company when we formed it around there were a number of people out of the L3, actually out of the L4 world who were very anti L3, and so there's no such thing, and that I think that's wrong. OEMs here can debate me, but I do think L3 has a significant potential. Having I drive a lot of my daughters at college at Wake Forest, and every time I go down to North Carolina, I'm like, God, this would be amazing to have a level 3 experience in a dedicated lane. I'd pay a lot for that experience. So that platform is basically dedicated operating environment. Again, very similar lane construct to those managed lanes. We're very bullish on that. I think, look, it'll take time, but the European manufacturers have really pushed ahead of there. Obviously, Ford and GM have big bets, I think, on level 3. The Argo situation, I think, was not as much about Argo at some level as a view that L3 is a real near-term opportunity. Todd can validate that perspective or not. Todd is our head of safety. He used to run safety at Argo. But yeah, so then the other two in trucking, we have two products. One is basically a drayage product, which is effectively a 1 to 10 mile movements around particularly inland ports. Now, what's interesting is I actually think seaports is a huge opportunity. Talking to Port of Savannah, talk to Port of Baltimore, there's definitely nervousness around talking about automation near ports in the United States. The Longshoremen Union and anybody who works at a port in the United States, is probably maybe the strongest labor lobby in the country. So that there's definitely nervousness around that. So inland ports in particular, and we've got a partnership with a company called Hillwood, largest real estate developer in Texas. It's actually Ross Perot Jr.'s development company, to effectively create an automated road platform within the gates, so to speak, of their inland port. That to me is like tomorrow availability. Like that concept, you could run your company's old truck, Two Simples trucks, you could run Kodiak trucks in these dedicated environments right now. Now, that's not the business model. We announced a partnership with Robotics Research. I don't know, are they a member of this? I don't know if they're a member of this. We got to get them involved if they're not. They're right up the road in Maryland. They're a phenomenal company. They are DoD's biggest autonomous commercial developer provider, and they basically launched a commercial business recently. So they're quite confident they could run basically a driver out operation in that kind of environment right now. And so I think the question is, can we create that environment? I think the longer haul Texas Triangle projects we think are, and you take the Triangle and you take I-10 and maybe I-40 to Tennessee, take that as a platform. And, I think, call it 5 years from now, if we can create a better operating environment for these trucks, they're running, as 45 all day, every day, but true driver out, I think is a couple of years away. And it's not because the trucks are not capable, it's just the safety questions. And so we're trying to simplify it, accelerate it, give them the kind of platform to do that. But it's funny, as the industry is consolidating, obviously valuations are getting crushed. I get all that, but it's one of these inevitabilities. I keep using the analogy of Interstellar, that scene when they look out and they think it's a mountain range and it's a wave. That scene is always so intimidating to me, but they're landing there and Matthew McConaughey's in there. He's like, oh shit, that's a wave. That's kind of where we are. It's just a question of how far out it is. So I think the wave in some ways is bigger than it was 2 years ago, but it may be a little further out. So.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks for reminding me of that scene. I'll have more nightmares tonight about that. But really, thank you so much. Everyone just join me in thanking Tyler for really appreciate it. The good news is we're only running a little bit behind now. So what we'll do is we'll quickly switch over to the first panel and we'll get that started in just a minute.
All right, we'll get started on our next panel. I'm Tara Sugiyama Patashnik, a partner here at Venable in our privacy and data security group, as well as with our autonomous mobility group. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists here today. First, we have Brian, actually, I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Kapatkin.
All right, thank you. Assistant General Counsel of Product, Regulatory, and Litigation from Volkswagen. Brian joined VW in 2018 and leads the company's legal function pertaining to NHTSA, regulatory compliance, safety policy topics, and certain product-related investigations and litigation. In addition to these core responsibilities, Brian also serves as a key counselor and thought leader in the company on burgeoning technologies, including autonomous driving and electrification. Prior to joining VW, Brian was in private practice at a firm in Washington, D.C., and also focused on commercial litigation and transportation regulatory compliance. And I think based on this litigation and background, we'll have some good insights for you later on this panel today. Then we have Carla Parada, Deputy General Counsel of Motional. Carla serves as Deputy General Counsel of this company, which is a joint venture between Hyundai Motor Company and Aptiv Technologies, which leads all commercial transactions and provides legal and compliance support across the business. She has extensive experience in both the automotive and high-tech industries, and she served in senior in-house counsel at both Raytheon Technologies and GM prior to joining Motional. She's licensed in Massachusetts and Michigan, and she's barred with the Supreme Court of the United States. Then Jeff Tucker, Corporate Counsel with Enterprise. Jeff focuses his practice on privacy, technology, data governance, information security matters. He joined Enterprise in 2017, where he provides legal support in areas such as GDPR, CCPA, CIPRA, data-driven business initiatives and strategy, marketing and advertising, employee privacy, incident response, commercial contract matters, emerging technology issues, and connected car initiatives at Enterprise. Prior to Enterprise, Jeff was with Scottrade Financial Services, Patriot Coal Corporation, and a law firm. And he's also certified in privacy. This probably goes for all of our panels today, and certainly with our government speakers who will be speaking later today, but they're here in their individual capacities. So please don't attribute what they're saying to their companies.
Especially if they say something really dumb.
Of course, if they say something really good, then be sure to let their companies know as well. So we're here to talk about managing all these different data streams that you just heard a preview from what we've seen in the past, what's coming forward. Let's see, Vin mentioned the Jetsons. So I like to think of that about, what does the future look like? And so when we're at a conference that's talking about mobility data, sometimes we might be thinking about connected cars or EVs. but there can also be dumb vehicles that have data. So to my panelists, and I'm not going to monitor who jumps in, so please just jump in over each other. What are the products that have what we're calling mobility data today?
I'm happy to kick things off as probably the least qualified member of this panel. I kind of think that Ariel invited me because he wanted to see how funny it would be to have a non-data lawyer on a data panel. I'm primarily a products lawyer, so I think about, but I do deal with interaction with NHTSA and DOT, and I was, trying to keep note of how many times Vin talked about data and how interested DOT and NHTSA are about data, but I lost count. I mean, it's been very true from my experience that with NHTSA primarily, that in our conversations and interactions, they are more interested in data of all types. And as much as we will give them voluntarily, they're happy to take and deal with. And there's a lot of pressure to do that, including some, as Ariel mentioned earlier, there's some that's voluntary and some that you're sort of voluntold to give them. So from a product's perspective, I think, when we're talking about, we don't call them dumb vehicles, but the less connected vehicles, I think about things like electronic event data recorders and vehicle telematics data that, but some of that's a little dumber than others. Those are the type of things that, from a product's perspective, we are dealing with on a regular basis, and oftentimes we use to defend ourselves in litigation or in if there's a regulatory investigation into an incident. Those are the type of things that we have to deal with pretty regularly, and I'm sure implicate other topics as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, even more sort of, I guess, basic data sets like braking patterns and fuel consumption. Those are things that are on, your everyday vehicles. And then a little bit more, maybe a step up from that and a step down from telematics, it would be, tracking devices through things like OnStar and other in-vehicle communication devices.
At Enterprise, we actually call ourselves a mobility company. So we have a lot of brands. We have car rental, which I think most people are familiar with. Then we've got car sharing. We've got a van pool / commute business. Most of these vehicles are connected. And there's also some other what we call aftermarket devices in our company, where we act as a facilitator for customers to purchase an aftermarket device that can also be used for connectivity. So those are our products.
Okay, so we have this universe of vehicles and devices that's producing what we're calling mobility data. What is mobility data to each of you? I mean, it's very broad and it's probably evolving, but as it stands now, when we say mobility data, what kind of data are we talking about? And we previewed some of it, but if we could just run down the line again as well.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, I tend to approach it kind of broadly. I mean, there is mobility data that's the data that's actually in the vehicle itself, that's stored on the vehicle, such as like an event data recorder. We have, alluded to, vehicle telematics, which communicates certain information either to different places. Sometimes it transmits it directly to the vehicle manufacturer. Sometimes it'll transmit it to an app. Sometimes it transmits it really nowhere. It's just used inside the vehicle. Those, I guess, are some types of mobility data. There's also, I guess, in a broader sense, there's some other types of data that that has to be reported on, whether it be under the TREAD Act or then it's a standing general order related to that's data that the company keeps or receives related to vehicles in the field, and that has to be handled in a particular manner and sometimes reported. But that's a little bit different spin on it than I think maybe we would traditionally think.
So for my company, we're a joint venture between Hyundai and Aptiv Technologies, and we are developing autonomous vehicles for ride-hailing services and partners. And so in our world, mobility data would also include things that we call PUDOs, pick up and drop off locations. Related to that, Curb data is becoming important to us. How are where people pick up their ride-hail service, how is that curb being utilized? We have things like restaurant deliveries now happening on those curbs, people on scooters, and just regular pedestrian traffic that's becoming relevant to us as we move out of R&D and into commercialization. In addition to that, roadwork databases that are that are publicly available and that governments are local governments are starting to put together, just so that we can get a better handle on what construction might be out there as the AVs hit the road. So.
Yeah, so at Enterprise, I think the first thing that jumped out is fuel. We use fuel to kind of streamline the old school way we pull your car back in and somebody's looking at the fuel reading and you're like, well, how'd you come up with that number? So we're streamlining that. We also look at maintenance. So Enterprise owns, the last time I checked, we own more cars than anybody in the world. So that means we also repair and fix more cars anywhere in the world. So we're talking preventative maintenance, we're talking maintenance, accident reconstruction, all that. On the location side, we move cars across the country. As you all know, sometimes you pick up the car and you return it in a different place. So that means that location is really important. And on that note, location is also really important for things like roadside assistance and emergencies.
Okay, so you all have different business models that are out there, and we've talked about the universe of data that's out there, but there's infinite data. How do you all generally, and other business models that you've seen as well, go about collecting this data, mobility data, and how might that collection differ depending on what kind of mobility data?
Do I have to go first for all of these? So yeah, no, it's fine. I'll try. So for certain things, I guess it's a little bit different. The traditional model for an old school vehicle manufacturer is a little bit different. Like, we don't necessarily have the direct relationship with our customers as clearly as certain other business models, because the vehicles are sold through a dealer. I mean, that's the way our state franchise laws are structured, and for most manufacturers. And so, the traditional interaction was between the dealer and the customer, and so getting certain customer data wasn't as much of an option for the manufacturer. Now there are new business models that are being adopted to maybe have a more direct interface, whether it's through apps or through other projects that are being initiatives that are being launched. And so that's we do collect a certain, obviously, information on warranties and warranty claims and all sorts of stuff like that, because like Enterprise, we are in the business of maintaining and fixing vehicles and providing information to dealers about how to do that. But now I think there's an effort and interest in getting closer to the customer and getting some more direct information. But that all comes, with potential regulatory requirements as well, in terms of disclosure and to NHTSA, et cetera.
Yeah, and similarly for us, we have the as I mentioned earlier, the partnerships with our robotaxi and ride-hailing partners. So a lot of that data collection happens through our ride-hail partners. Of course, we do collect a lot of data just by on the vehicle itself in order to make the AV move on its own. But there is this kind of preview a question that might be coming, but in terms of retaining that data for reporting purposes, I think there's a lot of assumption that we have all of the relevant data and that we can easily hand it to a regulator, but a big chunk of that data isn't ours. It's it's owned by our ride-hail partner, so that we have to sort of navigate that when it comes to both retention and reporting requirements.
Yeah, for Enterprise, we're kind of in a unique role because we own the vehicle, and then we also have a relationship with the customer. We buy the cars from the OEM. So the way it works with our company is the data comes directly in Enterprise. I know it stops along the way at the OEM, and then we kind of have a holistic approach with data at our company and it sits in a big data lake.
All right, just to give you a preview, Carla, you're going to go first, then Jeff, then Brian. So letting you know so that you can mentally prepare. This is a law conference. We're in a law firm. And so we've got all this data. And now what sort of legal policies and procedures do you all have in place to handle this data? And what are the general contours you previewed that, you have certain retention policies that might be addressed in these legal policies and procedures?
So at my company, we're developing that as we, like I said, we're moving out of the R&D phase into full, sort of commercialization. So we have a privacy working group that is dedicated and is cross-functional, made up of lawyers, our government relations team, product, engineering, safety. We're all in this privacy working group and determining those processes and procedures. It's just kind of it's going to be an ongoing thing as the company moves out of R&D and into commercialization. Defining both the amounts and types of data that we're collecting, how we're going to store it, how long we're going to store it, why we need it, and then to the extent we need to and should, we communicate that with our business partners as well. And then of course, because the bulk of my portfolio with the company is handling the commercial transactions, making sure that any suppliers that are working with us in that data collection space are also aware of what we need them to do and not do as it relates to the data.
Okay, I'll take you up the hook. So for our company, there's two things that jump out at me. The first is it's unusual, right, for all the privacy geeks out there to actually say that you can do privacy by design. I feel like half the time the train's already left the station. But in this case, this is a unique opportunity to actually design your systems. And so that's something that we take very seriously. The hallmark of that approach is we have our rental systems, which is all the information that our rental customers give us. And then you've got our connected car system. And we do not connect those two unless one of these use cases come up. And so that kind of leads to the second thing that jumped out at me. I think a lot of people in the audience have heard me say this. We hire more college graduates than any other company in this country, something like several tens of thousands a year. And so we have a lot of 20-year-olds, and these are great kids. They're the hallmark of our business, but we're very thoughtful in the training and all that goes into the beginnings of their careers. And so we design a system, one, to make sure that these can never be connected, but we really do take training extremely seriously.
Yeah, and again, this is a tough one for me to answer. I mean, I know that I keep getting threatened that my old emails are going to get deleted out of my inbox. So I know that there's definitely like data minimization policies in place. And I one thing that comes to my mind on this is, our privacy lawyer was telling me that California is basically requiring, data minimization for any sort of personal data, and I'm gonna try really hard not to get out over my skis with a bunch of privacy lawyers. But basically, the question, for me was how this works with our TRED retention obligations under the NHTSA regulations, and whether there's any real conflict there, and whether there are certain data sets that we have that we can maybe now have a little bit longer of a data retention period than they really need, and would that potentially present some legal risk in California or otherwise? And so I know that is an area that we've had to look into recently, whether certain things that traditionally had been sort of off limits, or we say, hey, let's just, there's a regulation that governs this, we should keep it for a little bit longer. But now there's other regulations coming out saying we really should take a closer look at this, and so we've definitely had to take a look at that throughout our organization.
So we have a lot of data, and presuming that your legal documents allow you to do things that are innovative with them, how are you managing what the confines are on and the restrictions on the data that you have with wanting to innovate and to produce new products? So you have a lot of opportunities. You're also managing against these restrictions, as well as other kinds of risks that you may face with data management. We'll start with Jeff.
Well, I mean, I think the term is role-based access controls, and that's the fundamental principle. We carefully vet every use case through the legal department, through our privacy department, and then after vetting that, then we make sure that our systems are designed so that the right people in the right roles are looking at the data. You can imagine how there could be issues with that in a company like ours. And we're just constantly vigilant about that, because for our particular company, our reputation is the single most important brand or asset that we own.
For us, I would say the biggest challenge is the volume of data that the AVs will collect, and how even if data retention requirements become are minimal, I think the stat now is on a test vehicle, an AV will collect between 11 and 152 terabytes per day. And so what do we do with all of that? I mean, it's an overwhelming amount of data. But on the how can we use it? How can we innovate to use that information for the benefit of the consumer? In our world, it would be making sure that we can have super accurate pick up and drop off locations. And then, anticipating preferences of the consumer. So if you hail your ride, your robo-taxi comes up and it's at the exact temperature that you want. And, it has all of those presets already set to you. I mean, that involves a lot of, PII and how do we make sure we have the appropriate safeguards over that, highly, personal data. So those are two things.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at this as a little bit of a different way. One of the challenges I think we have in a big organization is, making sure that all the different groups know the rules of the road, because a system might be developed for one use case, but then maybe some group in marketing, just for instance, hears about it and they're like, hey, well, we have cameras in the vehicles. What else can we do? And so I think, that's a bit of a challenge, from just from the legal perspective, is making sure that everybody who needs to get their information gets it, but also not stymieing progress. We have to hear out these ideas and see if there's a way to get to yes without taking on too much risk. But I think those are the there's whenever people hear about the opportunity to get more data, especially more data about our customers, it definitely there's elements within a company that want it, but we have to navigate that carefully to make sure that we're not taking on too much risk and obviously complying with all regulatory requirements.
So we've heard about all of your customers, and we alluded to the 20-year-old employees that start with your companies and others. So how might companies go about, and do you treat employee data differently from customer data? What sort of considerations go into?
Yeah, and I don't know the exact policies, but I think the short answer is, yes, we definitely, there are differences in the way, there's enhanced exposure risk, obviously, with respect to customer data. We got to care about our reputation. We don't want to be in a position where customers are going out and saying that Volkswagen or Enterprise or Motional doesn't care about our privacy. Look this information that got out. So I think that's really important, and I think the risk associated with that with employees is different. Of course, there still have to be some safeguards in place, but I think there's, I think it's right to treat them to some degree differently.
Yeah, I would echo that, and just add that within the realm of employee data, there are obviously different subsets, right? There could be employee health data that's very sensitive, employee data as it relates to, passport information, travel for like a travel system. So there are different subsets within employee data that I think warrant different levels of protection. But in general, I would agree that, yeah, there would be higher sensitivities and safeguards around consumer facing or consumer based data.
Yeah, I echo that as well, but I'll also say that we're in the business of managing what expectations are. And I think consumer and employee expectations are different. So we just have to be thinking about it. We can't treat them like a consumer. The other thing I'll add is that for our company, we have some unique issues that intersect with labor law and this, particularly out in California. For example, we have a lot of employees in the shuttle buses that drive the shuttle buses. They are organized labor, and so there's all sorts of interesting labor issues that come up.
Okay, well, I think that'll transition us into the next section on which laws apply here. So what are the frequent state and federal, to the extent that there are any laws that touch upon mobility data that all three of you come across in your daily work days, as well as industry best practices that are out there?
I'll kick things off. So the ones I deal with, I've already mentioned a few times. Obviously we're talking about certain like vehicle data about vehicle performance, whether it's a warranty claims and things like that. That has to be kept and reported under the TREAD Act. That would be one form of mobility data. Another one that was mentioned earlier, and I think is important. Vin mentioned it, is the new NHTSA standing general order related to reporting certain crash events involving either ADAS level 2 systems or ADS systems. I think one thing that's interesting about that is the way it was written, it sort of presumed that all manufacturers were sort of equally positioned to get notice of one of these events. And I don't think, as a practical matter, that is the case. I think in the public data that's available out there, it's very clear that certain companies are overrepresented. And I think that, say what you will about their drivers, I don't think that's exactly the reason why they're so overrepresented in such a report. I think it has to do with the fact that some companies are getting more real-time data from their vehicles than others. And I think probably NHTSA is banking on the fact that over time, manufacturers are going to be getting more and more of that real-time data, and that this data set that they are collecting is going to be more and more robust. But right now, it's frankly a very incomplete picture of what's actually happening on the road, in my opinion. And so it's we'll see how it evolves over time.
For us, the most relevant privacy laws are the CCPA and the CPRA. As we're doing delivery services through one of our ride-hail partners in the Santa Monica area. And then as we continue to deploy and roll out, we're keeping our eyes on Colorado, Connecticut, and Utah. Those privacy laws that I think sort of mirror the CPRA are going to go live by the end of this year. So those are the major ones for now.
Yep, for us, because of our business, we are an international brand. So somebody might rent a car in Washington, D.C. for pickup in London, and vice versa. So we are constantly really thinking about global standards. That's really how our company runs as a global brand. And so we often go to the cream rises to the top. We go to the highest standards. So that might include Canadian law, that might include GDPR. So that's one. And then two, there's just a hodgepodge of state laws out there. There's a vehicle rental statute in California. Recently, New Jersey passed a law about electronic surveillance. There's just a hodgepodge of laws that we have to keep on top of.
Okay. So are any of these laws contemplated to, you've talked about transportation laws, you've talked about privacy laws, but are there any out there that combine them? And if not, are there any best practices out there or industry principles that address that intersection right now that you've found to be helpful or that don't yet exist where you would find that to be helpful?
Well, I'll just touch on that a bit. So the NHTSA Standing General Order, I mean, that's not a privacy-driven document. It's a safety-driven campaign. But I think it does, from an OEM perspective, it does tie into the privacy laws and the privacy what you want to do from a privacy perspective, how much data you want to be collecting from your customers and from the vehicles, and what the risks are of doing that. I mean, there is, once you have that data, you need to be able to act upon it. You need to be able to report it. You need to be able to, defend. It may be useful in litigation. It may be harmful in litigation, and there might be reasons from a privacy perspective that you wouldn't want to be collecting all of that data or some of that data. And at a very minimum, you'd probably need some sort of consents to be agreed to by customers to be collecting some of this telematics data from the vehicles. So, there's at some level, there's a choice that has to be made there as to, where you stand on that spectrum.
So you just mentioned the general order and how that impacts what you collect, what you're thinking about. Is there anything else where there might be something out there like that really changes or governs how you go about data collection and your policies towards that?
I guess from an enforcement perspective, the FTC really is still the enforcement, agency out there. And so, but there is no specific, laws that relates to privacy and transportation. The FTC is treating AVs as just another way that, another device that's used to collect consumer data, and then it's regulated under traditional privacy laws. But from an enforcement perspective, just keeping that in mind when determining how much and how we're going to use the data.
Are there any other primary enforcers out there that we've touched upon? It's FTC, others.
No, I mean I echo what everybody else is saying. I think I just take a step back. I'm not trying to skirt your question, but I'm not trying to say that laws aren't important. But from my particular company, we have our own internal standards and values that are really the guiding point. And that's just where it all begins. And I'm not for 1 second trying to suggest that we're not looking to the law, but ours, that's been our compass.
Okay. And then one of you touched upon consent, and you all have different business models. And we're also looking towards the future. So the way one might have gone about obtaining consent, and in a way that complies with these laws, however well written they are. Like, how do you all go about obtaining consent or thinking about that as it exists now and how it might exist in the future?
I try to let other people think about it, but
ours, again, because of our ride-hail partners, a lot of our consents are obtained through them, but then we also provide opportunities for the consumer to provide explicit consents to us directly. For example, you have to advise when you're doing audio and video recording. So those in addition to the consent, you have to have clear placards in the vehicles and all of that. So ours is kind of a combination of explicit consent directly with us and through our ride-hail partners.
Yeah, Fred, and I know a minute ago I said we're a global company, but we do have to look at consent a little bit differently. So I'm just going to talk about North America. In our rental agreement, we do have a telematics section, and that's where we rely on our consent.
Okay. One of you mentioned cameras, so and that presents data privacy considerations, and there are administrative considerations, technical. administrations from you're all in the legal department. So what sort of things are you thinking through when it comes to, attempts at anonymizing data collection and whatnot with cameras?
So I've sat in on some of these conversations. I haven't really, I'm probably not the lead on them, but I think obviously the consideration is, is it a recognizable image of a person that you're collecting? Is it something that's anonymized? Is there a way of anonymizing it? And how long is it an instantaneous image that's not stored for any point in time? Where is it transmitted to? Is it transmitted anywhere? Does it stay on the vehicle? Is it focused in the vehicle or is it focused outside of the vehicle? And that makes a big difference. Is it only capturing the driver or is it also capturing occupants? I mean, those are all, big considerations, I think, in terms of camera placement.
In our case, a lot of times we're collecting data that we don't necessarily want, right? We need to see outside the vehicle, but we don't necessarily need to see people's faces. And so, but going back and blurring images is an administrative and technical, hurdle that we're working through. It would be, nice down the road. I don't know if there are capabilities for images to be sort of blurred in real time, but that would be, something to that would be a benefit, right? To make sure we're not over collecting, sensitive information that we don't need.
Yeah, there's a couple of examples that pop up. I didn't mention that we also have a car sales business where people sell their cars. And, sometimes people take pictures, for example, of them standing next to the car, things like that. So we're looking at software that would just wipe out all the people and just focus on the car. There's things like that we're looking at. The other example, I don't know if it's not directly connected to connected car, but when people use our rental cars, they plug in their cell phone into the infotainment port. And very often that means that the person after that, if they, not all the time, depending on the make and the model, they could actually see that person's maybe music or something like that. So we take a lot of effort to train our employees to delete that data. We have language in our rental agreement telling people to delete that data. So those are some of the challenges and solutions that we try to come up with.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing that I think is sort of, maybe not directly on the privacy side, but I think is going to be more and more prevalent is as you have more cameras on these vehicles that are capturing more things and the things you don't want to see, there's some exposure there from a product liability or litigation perspective. I mean, you could get subpoenaed for this type of information. It was a couple of weeks ago or maybe a month ago now, there was that famous video that was filmed by a Tesla that wasn't involved in the crash, but it showed, I think it was another vehicle, I don't remember, maybe a Kia, maybe something else, but it did like a whole front flip on the highway, and because I think a wheel from a semi truck like fell off, and I'm sure that's going to be Exhibit A in whatever litigation happens, resulting from that. So there's just it does create additional concerns from a legal perspective and potential exposure even beyond the privacy implications. But I think it could be a game changer in litigations as well.
So we know that there's state laws that are out there that you've mentioned, but then there are also federal ones. Do you see a benefit to having a federal legal framework that would govern mobility data, or are the states just so much better at this where we want to let them keep innovating and being labs of innovation? I mean, what works for you? And I think about the interstate system and, what roads would look like if we had let each state do that. How's that going to work with mobility data? What do you think would be best?
I think
okay.
From a company and I think ultimately a consumer standpoint, I think it would be most beneficial to have one, sort of federal framework that all states sort of abide by, and just making it easier for opt-ins and opt-outs, and having one consistent metric across the board, because as we know, we're all interconnected. In your global example earlier, somebody getting a rental car across the pond, we're just going to become more interconnected, and having a federal framework, I think, would benefit both companies and consumers, and the money that companies save in having one framework, they could pass on those savings to the consumer by not having to modify their approach to privacy in 50 different states.
Yeah, I mean, I would support that too. If it's one framework, as long as it's a good one, I think that would make a lot more sense. I mean, as a practical matter, I think, if you're doing business in all 50 states, you oftentimes have to, design to the lowest common denominator anyways. But if it's at a state level and maybe state A, or maybe Colorado is now the lowest common denominator, and then next week California is, and then the following month it's Maine. That's sort of not very tenable. So I think, you can't really comply in any reasonable sense. So maybe just for some clarity and ability to to actually design with confidence, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, we're in favor of a federal law. The consent piece alone, I mean, if you just look towards the future, a lot of the state laws seem to be geared towards an opt-out regime. And from our industry, that's just not going to work. If you imagine a connected car and somebody says they want to opt out of it, well, what does that mean? It means no car. But yeah, we're totally in favor.
Right. And then some of you mentioned that you work internationally as well. So have you seen laws abroad that either are working well, or that's something where we should avoid that in this country?
I mean, I can't get too much into the international stuff, but I can tell you it taught me a lesson. I'm the American lawyer sitting in my office in Missouri, and I won't name any countries, but I really just try to put myself in the mindset of other countries, other cultures, other people, other histories. To me, that's just very quick. I can't sit there and think like a Midwestern American lawyer.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on any of the foreign regimes. I hear a lot of people complaining about GDPR, but I don't know that, at least it's out there and it's something to aim for and strive for. So it's it's relatively uniform. So take the good with the bad, I guess.
Okay, so what's your version of the Jetsons? This is a fun question. Crystal ball, what does the future look like for mobility data for each one of you?
I'll just continue on the previous question on a federal. I would like to, I don't know if it's crystal ball or wishful thinking, but would like to see a federal law. But I do think it will be prompted by something, a huge data breach or some sort of like third party state actor or something that really brings privacy to the forefront and will get people pushing for the federal legislation. That's where I'd like to see it go.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the law, I think some clarity, uniformity would be good. I think we're at a point now. I think it's one of those things where I think it is what it is. We've heard it before today that we're not going to get a top-down clarity from DOT on exactly what we need to be doing to in all of these spaces. I don't think so. I think, but I think there are opportunities for some more clarity there that through engagement between the agency and the agencies and the companies, and hopefully we can find some common ground there and advance the ball. In terms of the Jetsons, I guess I would like to see that. Well, I really like the sound of not having traffic on 495. That sounded awesome to me. So if I'll take that as my Jetsons view.
We have great legal minds here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like sitting here and hearing everybody before and these panelists, like we all want to do good things with the data. And I think, I don't know, just there are some bad actors out there, but we're trying to save lives. We're trying to get people around. We're trying to, in our case, we're doing a variety of those things. So I'd like to see a future where it's more of a standards based legal framework that allows companies to do the right thing, and like we're all trying to do today.
Are there any areas that you would like to touch upon that I haven't asked you? You have the stage. Yeah.
I double down on that request for a traffic-free 495, but
And he walked out of here, so we'll have to get that back to him. All right, this is the special portion of today's panel where the code word for CLE is ice cream. So for all of you who want CLE credit, it's ice cream. All right, are there any questions for our panelists?
Brian, I'm Jeremy with Hospital. As more and more car companies are starting to offer multi-year free trials for connected services, what do you have to think about as you look to add, or for your business teams look to add more features, more functionality to that free trial that's already been deployed, already in use, and consented to by your customers?
So like additional functionalities, is that
Yeah.
sort of, yeah. That's a hot topic right now, and a hot topic in a lot of state legislatures as well. As I understand it, there's the dealers are interested. They don't like the idea. I hope this isn't offending anybody, but my simple understanding is that dealers don't really like that. Manufacturers have a separate cash stream that cuts them out, and so there are I think some bills going around that limit or potentially prohibit the viability of certain offering certain functions after initial sale. So that's a challenge. I think it's a changing environment there, and I think a lot is in flux. So that is a challenge with that. There's also certain functionality. We're getting to a world where the cars are more and more connected, right? More control units in the vehicles are connected or connected to each other, able to be updated over the air. But there are risks associated with that from, one thing's obvious, like a obvious cyber risk that you have to account for, but the, you have to, if you're changing certain functionality that might deal with disclosures to EPA or to the NHTSA or something that affects something safety relevant or compliance relevant, those are considerations that have to be taken into account. But it really, kind of depends on the function that we're talking about, I think. Does that address the question?
Yeah, I guess, do you try to shape like initial opt-in language to allow for future services to be added without trying to get consent necessarily for every little update or enhancement?
Without knowing directly, that's not, I'm not directly involved in that, but I would assume, I would have assumed that, we try to predict as much as we can and do, leave as much flexibility as possible under the laws.
Any other questions? All right, we will now have a 15-minute break so you can stretch your legs. And if you could join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
Two of our incredible associate attorneys who are going to be taking you through a deep dive into the state laws on AVs and privacy regulations. First, Katie Marshall. She's one of our dual threat privacy and mobility associates. Katie's privacy practice largely focuses on general privacy compliance work. She also works for the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, AVIA, where she focuses on state policy initiatives. And Ian Williams, who focuses on the development and deployment of AVs, federal and state transportation laws, connectivity and spectrum use, and privacy and cybersecurity issues related to emerging technologies. Also works with AVIA. Take it away, guys.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. For the next 40 minutes, we are going to provide an overview both of state privacy laws and state AV laws. On the privacy side, we will discuss how these laws can impact autonomous and connected mobility and provide an overview of key requirements under the laws that you see on the map. On the AV side, we will detail different approaches states have taken to AV regulation, which are quite varied, and discuss where state AV regulation is going. We'll save some time for Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions as we progress, please feel free to jump in. Happy to take questions throughout the presentation too. So starting on the privacy side, and I know we've talked a lot about privacy today, so this is going to give us a chance to do a deep dive and also discuss some late breaking news, because the map that we see here shows states with new rights-based privacy laws in blue. But what it doesn't show is the newest, which was signed last night by the Indiana governor. So there is now, while there's 6 on this map, there will be 7. The Indiana law will not go into effect until 2026, which is quite fortunate. The map also doesn't show how we are getting closer in a number of other states to having very similar laws. So Florida is getting close. Montana, that bill is waiting to be signed by the governor. Same with Tennessee, also waiting to be signed by the governor. So by the end of these state sessions, we will have even more states with rights-based privacy laws really filling out this map. And what this map shows is that there is increasingly a patchwork of state privacy regulation. But in many ways, the laws are more similar to each other than they are different. All regulate personal data or personal information, which is broadly defined under all of the laws to essentially include any information that is linked to or reasonably linkable to an identified or identifiable natural person. All apply to data about consumers, which are residents of those states. California, though, is unique, and I think a key refrain that we'll have throughout this presentation is that California is unique both on the privacy side and on the AV side. We'll spend a lot of time talking about California today. It likes to be special and important and different, and it certainly is doing so. But it is unique in the privacy space in the sense that a consumer under this law also includes a person acting in a business or personal capacity, like an employee or business contact. So the last panel talked a bit about employee data. What we see under the California law is that employee data becomes really important under the CPRA. So the way that that law is situated, which we'll discuss in more detail later, all of the rights that apply to general consumers under that law also apply to California employees and business contacts. So it's quite expansive in that way. The laws are also similar in the sense that they all have threshold triggers to be subject to the laws. So fortunately, it's not just, you operate in Colorado, all of a sudden you're subject to this law. You have to be doing business in the states in blue, as well as meeting certain threshold triggers such as revenue-based triggers or processing-based triggers, like processing data of 100,000 or more residents of that state. And we'll discuss key requirements of these laws a bit later, but to begin, we also want to provide some key dates for context, which I think this map will start showing them. So the first law is California. That was the first state that enacted these type of rights-based privacy laws with the CCPA that went into effect in 2020. It was amended and substantially expanded by the California Privacy Rights Act, which went into effect earlier this year, but it is not going to be enforced until July. So anyone who has been pushing off the CPRA, you still have a bit of time to come into compliance. We also have laws in Utah. That one is coming into effect at the end of this year. Colorado and Connecticut are going into effect in July. Virginia already went into effect earlier this year. And then Iowa is 2025, and now again, Indiana going into effect in 2026. And we'll discuss, you can see here, there's some discussion of cure periods. We'll discuss that towards the end, where I discuss a bit of some good news, bad news related to privacy risks. But we'll actually come back to this one. But first, we wanted to take a step back and discuss really how do these state laws matter for the mobility space. As earlier panels have discussed, there are many types of data collected in the transportation ecosystem. Some of this data may pertain only to vehicles or other technology and not necessarily be personal in nature where it's covered by the laws. However, as this industry becomes increasingly connected, data collected both by vehicles and through general business operations may be linked or linkable to a person, and maybe personal data is subject to state privacy laws. And I think it's useful to think of this data really in 3 key buckets. First is data collected through the vehicle or through general operations that may be tied to a person and then becomes personal. The next is data collected about personnel or business contacts, which is really important under the California regime. And then there's data collected through more specific operations or use cases, such as ride hailing. So starting with more vehicle type data, The previous panel had a bit of a discussion about information collected through cameras. Using that as an example, there is a potential for facial images that are being collected through equipment such as sensors or cameras to be personal data under these laws. I think there's a lot of open questions there to an extent because for instance, if a vehicle is collecting data about pedestrians, is that information reasonably identifiable to a specific person? Could you know who that person is? So there's questions there. But assuming that the data is personal, you then run into other questions of how is a company using that data? Is it being collected in a way where it would be considered a facial scan and maybe triggering heightened requirements for biometric data? And there can be, there's a lot of questions there. There's a lot of paths to hopefully having information not be subject to those heightened requirements, which can be quite onerous. But those are the type of questions that companies operating in this space need to be asking and considering. The next is precise geolocation information. A lot of that is being collected through vehicles. But as it relates to occupants of the vehicles, even if that is, for instance, like a safety operator of an AV or just a general person riding in a vehicle, you start getting into questions of, okay, how do we address how to comply with heightened requirements for precise geolocation information under the laws, which some of the laws have consent-based requirements there, others have opt-out, but it becomes challenging. Then thinking of personnel and business contact data, while the issues here aren't necessarily unique to the mobility ecosystem, they can be particularly impactful for a couple of reasons. First, so many companies operating in this space have operations in California. They may be headquartered in California. They may just be doing a lot of business in California, but there's a likelihood that they have employees or at least business contacts, including suppliers, who are California based. So all of that data could be subject to the California law, which, as noted before, extends rights equally to traditional consumers as it does to personnel and business contacts. This also can be challenging because under the CPRA, certain rights have to be provided to personnel and business contacts. And this can pose particular challenges given the sensitivities of this space. For instance, there's the opportunity for employees that may have rights under the CPRA to request access to personal data collected about them. But that data may be tied with competitively sensitive information. So for instance, if you have a disgruntled employee leaving, they want to request access to their data, that could be tied up with information that is really sensitive to the company and would be harmful if disclosed through an access report. Unfortunately, the CPRA was not drafted in a way to really have those type of considerations in mind. So any company with California employees who is dealing with questions like that has to look pretty exhaustively at all of the different exemptions under the law to see how they could tie together to protect a company's confidential information. Moving on then to more use case specific information, I think ride hailing is a good example where, for instance, in the robotaxi context, there's going to be personal data collected about occupants of that vehicle. But what becomes, I think, a key challenge in the connected mobility space is a lot of ride hailing is being done through partnerships. So for instance, you could have an AV company that is partnered with a traditional TNC, and then you get into questions of whose data is it? That also creates challenges because you have rights under these laws to opt out of certain data sharing. So you need to position the agreements and the partnerships between the parties to avoid implicating sales-based obligations. Because if there's a sale, consumers may have the opportunity to opt out. So all of this to say is there's a lot at issue here in the mobility space. And some of this information is subject to heightened requirements or just very challenging requirements to work through. Fortunately, as companies think through this, they may be able to take advantage of certain exceptions related to pseudonymized information, which could limit the scope of rights that need to be provided to consumers, as well as take advantage of exceptions related to de-identified data if certain technical processes can be. And moving back to just an overview of the key requirements. As we've been discussing, there are a number of ways that these laws can impact the mobility ecosystem, so it's important to be aware of the key requirements imposed by these laws. This provides a map that shows you at a high level the requirements under the laws with 2023 effective dates. As we know, Iowa is now coming into play, Indiana is, but those are all a bit later. And as you can see in this chart, there are a good amount of similarities, and something that's quite helpful about the way that the laws are drafted right now is you can read many aspects of them together and in harmony to develop a comprehensive compliance strategy. But a few things that they all do is they provide specific rights to consumers, and that's really the hallmark of these laws, providing access rights, deletion rights, opt-out rights, things like that. The rights themselves can vary a bit by state, but companies in this space are thinking about, do we just extend, the most rights available to all residents of certain states? Do we not take a state-by-state approach? There's options there. But as more and more states continue to proliferate these laws, there may be more of an impetus for applying these rights more broadly. Additionally, something that we'll discuss in a little bit related to enforcement is these laws can be very prescriptive in terms of how you designate methods for consumers to exercise rights. And not having those designated methods, such as a toll-free number under the California law, which is a bit antiquated, but is a requirement, can lead to enforcement to, even if it's not what triggers an enforcement action, it may be something that's brought up as a technical violation of a law. I'll also require certain notices, such as privacy policies. Privacy policies are really key in this space because they're one of the main ways that companies can demonstrate compliance with state privacy laws. And a lack of a compliant privacy policy can be a red flag to regulators as well as consumers and begin to invite inquiries which are not quite helpful. I'll also impose contractual requirements related to processors or service providers, which, as we discussed in the last slide, can be really important to consider for companies that are partnering with other companies in this space to make sure that there's appropriate data rights in place. One of the challenges of the processor contractual provisions is that for an entity to be a processor under these laws, they have to be pretty restricted in how they can use data. And most companies want pretty expansive data rights. Understandably, they have unique things they want to do with the data. But if a company is being positioned as a processor, they're quite limited in how they can use that data. So there's pluses and minuses to having those type of provisions in place. The laws also impose requirements related to assessments. For instance, if a company is selling data, which is defined quite broadly under these laws, that may trigger the need to do a data protection impact assessment. Or if a company is processing sensitive data, including some precise geolocation information, that may also trigger requirements to conduct assessments, which could be requested by a state regulator. And then a major difference that you see on this chart, which we've discussed over and over, is that the CPRA is unique in the sense that it is the only law right now that applies to personnel and business data. But everything above that you see will apply to personnel and business data too. And then moving on to the good news, bad news slide. So the last slide outlined almost a to-do list of what companies should be considering if they're first beginning to think about privacy compliance. The good news is that some of the risks under these laws is mitigated by the fact that the laws are all enforced by government entities. There are not private rights of action under the laws, with the exception of a limited data breach element of the CPRA. But that's helpful that they're regulated and enforced by government entities. Another thing that is quite helpful is that by and large, the laws have cure periods. So if a company receives an inquiry that they have not been, or some sort of allegation that they haven't been compliant with the law, there is generally an opportunity to cure. Here again, California is a significant outlier. The CCPA used to have a cure period, but when the CPRA went into effect earlier this year, this cure period went away with it. So that's the bad news part of the slide, is that there is an ability for risk to be mitigated under the non-California laws, but there is more significant risk under the California law because of the lack of cure period. Another aspect that increases risk with respect to California is that there is a new agency that is tasked with just enforcing this law, the California Privacy Protection Agency, which is largely funded by its own enforcement actions. So it has has many reasons why it would be actively enforcing the law. And we have also seen the Attorney General under the CCPA being an active enforcer as well. And also we know of at least one action that has involved transportation too and implicated the automotive industry. That from time to time, the AG updates its website to address a few notable cases that are all anonymous, But in this one, according to the AG's website, an automotive company collected information from consumers who test drove vehicles, failed to have a notice at collection as required under the law, which would describe how information is collected and used about individuals. It also failed to have a compliant privacy policy, and it also did not have a toll-free number for consumers to submit requests. And when we think of privacy laws, a lot of people, I think of how these laws impact industries heavily involved in consumer data, like advertising or certain other industries. It's not, I don't think transportation is necessarily the first thing that comes to people's mind, but it is certainly coming to regulators' minds, and they're showing that this industry is very important to them too from an enforcement perspective, which I think increases risk in the space too. But overall, as these laws go into effect, the new ones that we see largely have cure periods as well. So we will see what enforcement looks like under these laws, and time will tell how aggressively the laws will be enforced. And now Ian will turn to the state AV landscape, but before we do so, the code word for today is koala, if you're looking for CLE credit. It is koala because today apparently is National Wildlife Koala Day. The more you know, but now to Ian.
A lot of learning being done today. So when we turn to state AV laws and regulations, we're in a similar discussion as Katie just covered with privacy laws, that we're looking at a state-by-state situation with rather different structures for governing and permitting the use of autonomous vehicles, depending on the state that you're trying to operate within. So right now you can see on this map, color-coded, there's 33 different states and the District of Columbia that permit some use of autonomous vehicles, ranging from places that limit, states that limit that kind of use to testing only, all the way up to places that expressly allow testing and deployment of vehicles. And those are the teal colored states there, the dark blue being testing only. As I said, what can be permitted under these things can go anywhere from required human safety driver and testing only without passengers, all the way up to robotaxi operations and commercial motor vehicle operations that we see in some of these states. As for testing only, there's currently 10 states in DC. The requirements there, as I mentioned, human in is a factor. In states like Hawaii require a human to remain in the vehicle at all times. Most of these states also require some sort of permit with permission to operate, either from the State Department of Transportation or a state law enforcement agency. So for example, Maryland has a permit process through Maryland's DOT. So if you're going to try to operate there, you need to first go through permitting process. Some of these states have passed AV laws, but then don't do much of anything with them. New Hampshire, as an example, being one where the New Hampshire Assembly passed a state AV law, put the onus on the New Hampshire Department of Transportation to then operate a program to develop and test AV, or test AVs on New Hampshire roads, and that has not occurred. So in some cases, with all the good intentions on all sides, it just doesn't get to any place where you get close to a deployment of any kind. Two states that are an outlier are Alabama and Louisiana, who right now limit AV operations to only commercial operations. So they are, in those states, you're able to operate commercial motor vehicles, long haul trucking and such, but there is no permission for anything like a robotaxi or really any other forms of AV usage. And similar structures in both of those states where you're required to meet liability requirements is $2 million in liability in both of those states. And you have to submit materials to the state DOTs to kind of explain what you're doing and the behaviors your vehicles can undertake. We'll move to expressly able to deploy. That's 21 different states here, including California, which is a bit of an outlier, and we'll get into why. Much like in privacy, California has imposed a much more complicated structure on the use and deployment of AVs than some of these other states like Texas or Mississippi or anything like that. When we talk about testing and deployment, as I've already said, testing is usually this very limited use case. It may be research only, it may R&D kind of work, or even just projects by state universities or something to that effect. it's limits in scale, and what we see at an industry level, as many of you may know, states that have limited operations to testing just do not see that much activity because it's a burden to industry to try to be limited to testing only, and also to be, you know, to not have the ability to kind of explore new use cases, expand operations as you grow and learn about what your technology is able to do. So the vast majority of development and deployments of AVs are going to be in these teal colored states, and California included, where the door has been opened much more widely for all sorts of novel vehicle designs to be used on the road, all sorts of business cases to be tested and developed, and just really, you know, giving a window for people to actually operate the vehicles. I'd be remiss to not mention that here at Venable, we're counsel to the, it was mentioned, the counsel to AVIA, the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, and one of the AVIA's continuing projects is working on model law, which is then brought out into the states and trying to get, you know, sensible AV legislation passed in a number of states. And AV has been very successful a lot through Katie's efforts and the rest of our team to get, you know, sensible, good AV laws and expand the map here for AV testing nationwide. So digging down a little bit more deeply, as I mentioned, California has highly structured process when compared to a number of other states. And then we're going to compare that to Mississippi, which is a state that is much more structured, much more in line with a number of other states and more permissive of operations. So California has a tiered structure working mostly through the California DMV and then through the California Public Utilities Commission, depending on what type of operations you're trying to undertake. The California DMV is going to permits first AV testing, starting with human in testing, graduating to human out of vehicle testing, and then eventually issuing deployment permits when you actually want to move beyond carrying just your own employees or certain kind of guests of your corporation and start really carrying members of the public. But to actually carry members of the public, you then move beyond the DMV's purview into the California Public Utilities Commission, which covers ride hailing, for hire transportation and the like. And they have developed a similar permitting system where you're first permitted to operate a robotaxi with a human safety driver, and then graduate to a system where you can operate without a safety driver. And we're seeing that right now in San Francisco with testing, with human out testing of robotaxis and the deployment of robotaxis. And they're actually, it's only when you hit the deployment level, that kind of top tier permit with CPUC, that you can actually charge people for the rides you're giving them. Anything below that tier, you're still providing that service for free. California has a $5 million insurance requirement, self-insurance, insurance policy, whatever the given company can provide, but that is, you know, higher than the insurance requirements for a personally owned vehicle, obviously. And the other factor in California is they have, unlike if we saw Louisiana and Alabama permitting only commercial vehicles, motor vehicles to be used in as AVs. Here in California, you're seeing anything above 10,000 pounds is prohibited. And there's some ongoing debate on that issue. But for now, California is limited to only, passenger vehicles and below 10,000 pound operations. The AV law in California is also structured around the manufacturer. So the entity, a manufacturer can be anyone who has either constructed a vehicle and that built a vehicle that includes an integrated ADS, or it could be an entity that modifies an existing vehicle into an AV by installing the ADS and the sensors and all the other equipment. But the law is structured around the manufacturer as the entity. So it's not a personal individual ownership structure or permitting structure. It is much more, as a manufacturer, you have to go to the DMV and attest to a lot of, you know, the capabilities of your vehicle, attest to the testing and design work you've done. Then you can get your permit, and then only then the manufacturer can move on. Once you've had the first level testing permit, then you can get the second level, then you can get the deployment permit, then you can go to CPUC. So you're climbing the ladder as your technology matures, and you don't get to, just because you've developed the technology somewhere else, you don't get to cut in and get you can't go straight to the CPUC even if you've fully developed an AV and it's fully functional because of testing you've done elsewhere. You have to kind of acquiesce to California's structure and work your way up through their system. Mississippi, as a counterpoint, this is a structure that's much more in line with the model bill that groups like Avia has put together. It's much more in line with a number of the other permitted states, which is it's an open door to AV deployments. There's no distinctions in this law and other laws like it between testing and deployment. It's just about the operation of the vehicles. And in Mississippi, and as I said, these are typical of a lot of states' AV laws. You have a requirement that the vehicle be able to meet a minimal risk condition. You have the requirement that the AVs are able to comply with applicable traffic laws. A lot of states require what's called a law enforcement interaction plan, which is provided either to local law enforcement where you're testing and deploying, or provided to state law enforcement agencies. And the point of an LEIP is to provide first responders, especially, the ability to interact with a vehicle, to understand how it's going to behave, to understand how they can pull it over, who they can contact if one of these vehicles is misbehaving. And so that's a pretty common requirement, just because there's a lot of concern on the first responder and law enforcement side about, well, how do we especially if you've never seen an AV before, trying to figure out how to interact with it can be a challenge, or it was perceived as a challenge, so they required these kinds of plans to be provided. Mississippi has no added insurance requirements for AV operations. You're just insuring the vehicle as you would any other traditional vehicle. Then on-demand networks are permitted. That's a structure you see in a lot of state laws, a specific permission for AVs to be used as part of on-demand ride-hail services. Sometimes it's pursuant to, so Mississippi, for this example, that is pursuant to existing taxi for hire rules, TNC rules. Other states, like Texas, for example, have exempted AV operations from some of the more specific TNC rules. Standard title and registration requirements, that is another thing where, depending on the state, you may be as in California, you may be required to provide more information to the DMV when you go to register and title in the AV. In Mississippi, you're waiting in line with everybody else at the DMV to get that thing registered and titled. And finally, a fairly common feature of a lot of state AV laws is preemption of local AV laws. So a lot of state AV laws are written to prevent localities and municipalities from either banning the operation of AVs, limiting the operation, or really regulating them in any way. That's also true in California, and you may have seen news coverage of that, where the city of San Francisco has complaints about the AV testing that's going on in San Francisco, and they have to take it back to the California DMV or the CPUC. They don't have the ability to regulate that because, like other states, California preempted any sort of local authority related to AVs.
And I think on the preemption too, just another point to add about why that's so important is most states that have AV laws do have preemption of local rules. However, not all of them do. What we have seen in the past couple of years is that some states that do not, two in particular, states that do not have that level of preemption have had cities that have created their own regimes for AVs. So New York City developed its own AV testing permit program in 2021. It is very different than the structure that is in place at the state level. This also happened in Seattle last year, actually just a few weeks after the state's new AV regime went into effect. Seattle, seemingly overnight, put forward its own set of local rules, which in Seattle in particular, it can be quite problematic because there are some entities that would be able to operate in anywhere else in Washington state, but they would not be able to operate in the city of Seattle because of the way that their operations function. The distinction there is that Washington state does not require a human driver to be in a vehicle in an AV, but Seattle does require that. So the fact that there is not preemptive language in place in Washington state and states like it can create significant challenges as companies are seeking to comply with a patchwork of regulation.
Yeah, and that's a great segue. I'm going to go back to the state map to kind of explain how these laws interact with the AV industry writ large. What's interesting for some of these states some of the states where you see the most AV testing were first movers or early adopters, places like Arizona, Nevada, California. Other states that jumped quickly into the game don't see as much deployment, I think like Michigan. Michigan had an AV law pretty early, obviously with their ties to the automotive industry, but you don't see as much testing in part because of weather conditions. So a lot of AV testing in the AV industry overall has grown very strong in the southern states, and especially the I-10 corridor going all the way across the U.S. up through, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, where you're able to, as you can see, a long line stretching from North Carolina all the way to Arizona, where you could operate, especially commercial motor vehicles, across longer distances, really start to really test use cases, understand how these vehicles can operate on long haul structures. And that's why you see places like Arizona and Texas as real hubs of AV development and deployment, and again, especially in commercial, but also in ride hailing and ride sharing. It's also the weather that definitely helps. But the fact that these states have all gotten on board and have created longer and longer corridors really improves the business case and allows a lot more testing of operations. Of course, for commercial motor vehicles, you're stuck at the California border, given the prohibition on 10,000 pounds or above. But the same is true for robotaxis. You see, Arizona, certainly a hotbed of activity with robotaxi development, in part because they opened the door pretty early and they created a really industry-friendly structure that allows companies to come in, develop their technologies, test their technologies, and really, get to know communities, understand community needs, work out, what does it mean to run a robotaxi, and that is California. In that case, is the outlier, given how much more complicated their structure is in regulating AVs. But California obviously has the advantage of Silicon Valley. So the fact that so many AV developers were based in or had operations in Silicon Valley meant that the body of knowledge and the recruitment opportunities in especially the Bay Area were so strong that even as the system became more complicated to get your vehicles on the road, it didn't quite dissuade companies from continuing to test and operate there. And so you see over 50 companies with permits in California right now to operate AVs at one level or another, just by sheer weight of the engineering talent in that state. We're also now, though, seeing, I mentioned briefly, pushback. We've had the first, in the last 10 years, give or take, is when all of these laws were passed and developed. You're starting to see pushback from certain entities just based on kind of the robust growth in the AV industry. Some people have now taken notice. We've gone from testing a few vehicles in a few given places to really, apparent, clear operations. You can see these things all the time if you go to San Francisco or in Phoenix. And as the industry grows, so does pushback at times. So you're seeing work at state levels by certain entities who are trying to limit deployments or pull back some of the permissions that have been given. And that's going to be, I think, ongoing. That's going to be a fight of as there attempts to roll back some of the permissions AVs are having. It's definitely going to be a challenge moving into the next 5 years, probably.
And we have some time left for questions if anybody has any questions. Go ahead.
Proposed legislation that might be privacy adjacent. So the Washington My Health, My Data bill is not necessarily related to cars, but there's a lot of different implications based on the language, be it the location piece or some of the broadness of the definitions that could potentially implicate cars. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that, not only from sort of like an advising kind of perspective, but just also what that might look like as we see that kind of pop up as it gets to be more specific on specific kind of topics across the states.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. That bill in particular is a good example, but there are a lot of bills like that that we've seen in the past couple of state sessions where it can be a privacy focused bill, but they need to be looked at very carefully to see how they could impact the automotive industry. And I think what's key there is the definitions become very important. And with different advocacy groups being able to potentially make changes during the legislative process, because a lot of those type of bills are not really intended to impact the automotive industry, but they can certainly have unintended consequences. So being able to intervene early and educate legislators on what the definitions would do, what type of consequences they could have, and being able to amend the bill to really clarify what the scope is supposed to be, that can be quite helpful. But that type of work will certainly be ongoing as more and more privacy adjacent bills are introduced.
Yeah, and I would just, from an automotive and AV perspective, it's education of state regulators, of state lawmakers to understand just the umbrella of technology law growing and touching on things that they would never think of. I mean, you see a lot of AI-based regulation in law too, where when you start to, depending on the definition, a lot of things could be AI if you write a very loose definition, including autonomous vehicles. So, being proactive as an industry to make sure when you see even something that seems tangential on its cover could have a lot of effect on your operations or your technology overall. And getting down into the state capitals is really important in that case.
Go ahead.
You alluded to the complaints in San Francisco right now of there's all these AVs clogging corridors and parked in places they're not necessarily parked, but they're making it difficult people are perceiving it that they're making it more difficult to get around. I think the alternative side of that would be that, well, the car is doing what it's designed to do and it's adhering to all the rules. And I guess my question is, are you aware of any efforts or progress in discussions with either the state entities or local entities on making the traffic rules more AV friendly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wouldn't say I'm not aware of discussions with those entities about traffic rules specifically, but I know that it's something that the AV industry itself is looking at, and is considering ways that potentially designated lanes for AVs, things like that, to help make the infrastructure work better for newer technologies. By and large, AVs do not need unique infrastructure, but there are ways that the infrastructure could be improved. So I think right now that's in the early stages where discussions are ongoing, and once those become more developed, the thought would be taking proposals to key stakeholders.
Yeah, and right now a lot of that's solved through partnerships with state and local entities, and that's part of the impetus behind state laws requiring like law enforcement interaction plans, is to try to bring people to the table and talking with law enforcement, talking with mass transit providers, talking with anybody who might be government-wise who might be operating on that road, and teaching them about the technology's capabilities and the kind of where these vehicles are going to be, what they're going to be doing, and how you interact with them when you run into them on the street.
We feel great about marsupials. We are really team Quality, so really feeling strong about that.
So yeah,
All right.
CLE credit koala.
Thank you.
We're going to start in a couple of minutes to get the next panel set up.
Sitting anywhere in particular? How many? Four of us. Four. And I'll probably stand. Meet in person.
Second or two.
So.
The hush has started. Okay. Well, thank you all for reconvening this afternoon, and we really appreciate all of you that have stayed throughout the day. I know this is a huge commitment, and you're giving up an entire day of work, and we really appreciate it. For those of you that don't know me, I am David Benelli. I'm a partner here at Venable in the Autonomous and Connected Mobility Group. I started about 4 months ago with Ariel, and I'm really excited to be here today. Our previous panel talked a lot about the issue of mobility data in the context of the use, collection, management, all things. Tara did a great job of asking a lot of questions in a lot of different contexts. I think what we'd like to do with this panel, as you can see from the title, is to speak about it a little bit more directly in the context of government use and access. So to that end, we've assembled an esteemed panel of industry professionals, former government officials, association professionals, to talk about the context of mobility data through the lens of government use and access, right? How do governments collect this information? Why they collect this information? What's the purpose? When they get the information, what do they do with it? We'll talk a little bit about how they respond to their requests, and we talked a little bit about this earlier today, but we're going to dive a little deeper into that context. So joining me on stage today, we have 4 panelists. They didn't sit in the order that I lined this up, but that's okay. So I'll start with James Owens on the far end, and I'll give brief introductions. And I encourage them to talk a little bit more about what they do and who they are when they give their responses as well. But James joins us as Deputy General Counsel and Head of Regulatory Affairs at Nuro, a company developing and operating autonomous delivery vehicles. I'm sure some of you have heard. Before joining Nuro, and we're really going to grill James on this today, he served as former acting administrator for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which you've heard about a lot today, and as Deputy General Counsel at USDOT, where he helped launch and lead the department's regulatory reform task force. Matthew Dickens is Director of Policy Development and Research for the American Public Transportation Association. Matt leads the APTA research team in producing reports on issues affecting the transit industry and maintains APTA's industry statistics program. Jeremy Agolnik, Senior Vice President, Connected Vehicle at HasAlert. Jeremy is responsible for helping automotive OEMs deliver a safer, more connected driving experience to their drivers and driving systems. And prior to joining HasAlert, Jeremy held a variety of product management and strategy positions at Here Technologies, where he launched and expanded a number of location-based products and services globally. And then finally, Aparna Paladugu, Director of Policy and Government Affairs at VIA. Aparna oversees VIA's policy and government affairs and community engagement efforts. Prior to joining VIA, Aparna managed policy and regulatory affairs at Zoox. Aparna has also served as an appointee in the Obama administration at U.S. Department of Commerce and on the policy team, and was on the policy team at the Human Rights Campaign. So great group of diverse panelists that we're really going to dive into a lot of different issues and specifically in the government context. So why don't we dive in? I'd like to kind of sort of think about this first in the context of the use cases. And I've talked to the panelists about this too, like how does data collection relate to the work that they specifically do, and how do they engage with government on that? But I want to sort of level set a little bit, and I talked to James about this too, and asking him to sort of put his hat on as former acting administrator and government official. James, the federal safety agency, we've talked a lot about this today, like NHTSA, has a lot of regulatory tools and enforcement tools at its disposal, but it also uses data collection. So I'm curious, how does data collection fit into the use of those tools? What do they use it for? Why would they be collecting it from transportation entities? And what do they use it when they do get it?
Thanks, David. Look, good policy follows good data, right? If you're going to be engaged in a proper policymaking process, you need to have really sound, useful, actionable data, because you need to understand what's going on out there, what works, what doesn't work. You need to understand where the trouble spots are. You need to understand where the intensity of the trouble spots are. One of the things that's funny now that I'm in my current role, you think of government as having unlimited resources, but when you're on the inside, you feel like you have such a scarcity of resources and you never have enough time to do anything. And so when you're at an agency, you need to, if you're trying to do this the right way, you need to focus your resources on the highest, biggest problems that you're facing. And, so it depends on the agency. If you're a safety agency, you're looking for what are the biggest safety challenges that we're facing in our system and how do we fix them and knock them out one by one. And that starts with good policy, good data and good data collection. Now, of course, having said that, I'll step back and say not all data is good data. And that's a second challenge I think any government agency has. If you are, when you're collecting data in the government, there's sometimes a temptation, let's get it all. Let's open the fire hose up. Let's collect everything we can possibly think of. Well, that's also a bad idea for a variety of reasons. One, it's bad for industry because it turns out there are people who have to collect that data and present it to you. And that costs a lot of time, a lot of resources to put that data together. And then secondly, you, the agency, you have to decide, are you actually going to be able to review this data? Are you going to be able to actually look at it? Or is it going in the Raiders of the Lost Ark archive and you're going to pull it out maybe one day in the future? So you have to balance that sort of that question of we want data, but we want to be smart about what data we're gathering. So it's a give and take. There's no perfect answer. There's no magic bullet that's going to solve the problem, and it's going to evolve over time, of course. Now, from NHTSA's perspective, a federal safety agency, NHTSA, as you know, oversees motor vehicle safety in the United States, right? NHTSA's goal is to help save lives, reduce injuries, while sustaining our transportation infrastructure on the roads. Now, what does that really involve from sort of the parochial view of NHTSA? Well, number one, you want to take a look at the vehicles themselves. You want to make sure the technology is safe. You want to keep an eye on how the vehicles are behaving. And you want to keep an eye on trouble spots or problems that may arise so you can get in front of those problems and try with industry to fix those problems. But that doesn't stop there. You're also looking at behavior. Human behavior is a huge part of the safety problem we have on our roads. And so you want to collect data on human behavior. And frankly, tertiarily, you want to collect data on the infrastructure and the safety of the infrastructure. NHTSA is not a funder of infrastructure, but NHTSA does fund highway safety programs in tandem with the states. So stepping back again and looking at how NHTSA collects this data and what NHTSA is actually collecting. On the technology side, most of you are probably very familiar with this, especially if you own a car. NHTSA, there's a defect warning system in place. If an automaker detects a malfunction related to safety, they have to advise NHTSA of that fact. They have to file a public filing with NHTSA. It's a 573 filing. And then they have to conduct a recall campaign to repair that for free, assuming that it is an unreasonable risk to safety. In addition to that, and more broadly than that, NHTSA has what's called the EWR, the Early Warning Reports. It's Part 579, 49 CFR, Part 579. So what is the EWR? So this is a series of reports required by Congress that the OEMs have to present to NHTSA on a quarterly basis, relating to fatalities, relating to overseas recalls of similar vehicles, related to other crash information, related to warranty claims. And of course, the OEMs are presenting information that includes the VIN number of specific vehicles. When the OEM becomes aware from what's called a field report of a fatal crash involving one of their vehicles, they have to include that in the database, including something sensitive PII or something could lead to PII like a VIN number. And then NHTSA sifts that data. A very large organization, the largest part of NHTSA is ODI, the Office of Defects Investigation. And what ODI does, they over 100 engineers in ODI, they they sift through more than 70,000 consumer complaints every year. They sift through the EWR data, and they sift through any other information that they may find, like information that might come in miscellaneous from the state government, let's say. And then they are looking for trouble spots that they can identify, and then start talking to the OEMs, maybe launching investigations of potential defects. Second, what is NHTSA doing on behavior? What is NHTSA collecting on the behavioral side? So NHTSA is working with the state and local governments to collect a variety of data associated with highway safety. So NHTSA collects what's called the FARs. Let's go to the FARs every year. That's the fatality report that you read about in the papers a couple times a year. And that's all data collected by state and local entities. It comes into NHTSA. NHTSA has a model uniform set of crash characteristics that they would like to see in the reports, but in fact, all the entities give a wide variety. That comes in, that gets, NHTSA actually has to go through every fatal report. It's what's called a census process. They go through every fatal report. They confirm fatalities. They look for death certificates. They look for obituaries. They actually have to have multiple data points to confirm a fatality. And then they can present what is actually very accurate fatality data for the United States. But then, of course, fatal crashes, fortunately, are a distinct minority of all the crashes we have. We have what are called injury crashes and then what NHTSA calls PDOs, property damage only crashes. NHTSA doesn't have the resources to have a census approach to all of that data. So NHTSA has selected a variety of communities around the country that the agency believes are representative of the whole, and has a statistical sampling process in place, and agreements in place with the local entities to collect data on a sampling process, and that so that they can estimate how many PDOs and injury crashes are happening. So that's and then they put that together so we can see the trends. Where are the crashes happening? Under what circumstances are they happening? Are they happening at night? Are they happening during the day? When pedestrians are being struck by vehicles, what are the typical scenarios? Then NHTSA takes that sort of data, and they will then start learning that there are particular, let's say, crash scenarios that are particularly dangerous. One crash scenario I recall is in an intersection, and what's called an oblique crash, where somebody turns too sharply and they hit each other, and more than 1,000 people die every year in an oblique crash situation. So when NHTSA learns that, then they can start working with the OEMs on updating NCAP to maybe have new tests for NCAP, or potentially updating the FMVSS to incorporate sort of the crash worthiness requirements from that. So they take that data and they're trying to make it actionable by working on by looking at the ways in which they can mitigate that damage. And then finally, very quickly, there's a little bit of data that NHTSA collects about individuals. NHTSA has a pointer system. It's called the Problem Driver Pointer System. And anybody who it's a pointer system that the states subscribe to. And if you have your driver's license suspended or revoked or denied for any reason, if you have a variety of serious incidents on your driver's license, that the state, now NHTSA can't force the states to do this, so it's a voluntary behavior by the states. The state can provide that information to the NDR, the National Driver Registry. And then if somebody who loses their license in Illinois wants to go pick up a new license in Ohio, now the folks in Ohio have the opportunity to know, wait a minute, this person lost their license in Illinois. Should we, under our law, do we have the ability to block them from getting a license, or should we block them from getting a license? That's a DMV decision, not a NHTSA decision, but trying to make that information available to the public. So writ large, those are sort of the three broad buckets of information that NHTSA is gathering. By and large, that information is being used for purposes that are directly relevant to NHTSA's authorities, which directly pull back to the policy positions that NHTSA has.
Thank you, James. That's very good. Thank you for that context. Shifting gears a little bit, Matt, I want to talk a little bit about this, like in the transit context, right? As somebody, representing, working with transit agencies, we talked a little bit about this, but given public daily interaction with transit systems all day long, every day, I imagine there's a lot of unique data collection considerations. And we talked a little bit, Tyler talked a little bit about it in the toll booth context, but in the transit context, you have people coming in and out of systems all day long. That data is getting collected. Like, what are some of the unique sort of data collection considerations in the transit space?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Our agencies are collecting, all sorts of kind of information that some people might think of as sensitive about, daily travel habits, things like that. And especially now with, it's not new anymore, but new technology like, tap cards, things like that on transit, it makes it much easier to sort of not only gather that data, but have a record for a sort of individual person, right? So, you may be able to look at one person's card and see all of the places that they go and exactly where they go on the transit system. So that is something that the agencies, take very seriously, and that data, and definitely at the agency level, is held very closely and used a lot for sort of internal agency kind of planning, things like that. We want to take that data and use it to sort of figure out, well, where do people want to go, and take that data to say, where might people want to go that we're not serving as well, things like that. But also we work through things, I know some of the previous presentations talked through things like, de-identification of data and things like that. Our agencies do things like that in order to provide that data for, other government entities to use in planning, trip, tracking, trip use, things like that. And also for research purposes, in terms of people using that, researchers using that data to do analysis on travel patterns, things like that. So, it is something that we think about a lot. I think for transit agencies too, this idea of, being asked to provide data, or, transit agencies are public agencies now, but once upon a time they were private companies too, like a lot of the people in this room. And being asked to provide data on various levels isn't a new thing for our industry. You can go, to the Library of Congress and look up things like the 1902 Census of Street Railways, and has information about all the street railway companies in the United States, and things like, miles of track and what they did and how many horses they owned, because that's what they did at the time, and things like that. So, it's an issue we've faced for, over 100 years now.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Matt. Aparna, sort of similarly situated, because VIA is known to a lot of folks here as a company that does a lot of work with transit agencies, has a lot of partnerships in that space, including some of the AV work that you're doing. Can you speak a little bit about, in that context, those partnerships, what is the collaboration like with a transit agency or a government like, and does that involve some sharing of information? Some, does it require that as a cost of doing the business with the agencies or doing the partnerships? Can you speak a little bit about that? Did you get it?
Great, thank you.
Okay,
Sorry
sure.
about that. Well, great to be here. And yes, happy to answer that question. I'll briefly just describe too, for those of you who aren't familiar with VIA, and what we do and what we're doing in the autonomous vehicle space. I'll just give a very brief background on that and then answer your question specifically. So VIA is a transit technology company. We provide software and services for public transit agencies and other public entities like state departments of transportations, municipalities like cities and county governments. What we're most known for, I'd say, is our on-demand transportation technology. So that's software that enables transit agencies and cities to do shared rides. So think about bus service, but with smaller vehicles like minivans or minibuses. This is on demand, so it enables transit agencies to provide service that's really not limited in terms of service area, like a fixed route, and folks can order via phone or via an app. And so it really enables transit agencies to fill gaps in transit deserts in urban areas or in rural areas, or really look at
boosting existing fixed route transit by providing first and last mile. So the way we're integrating AVs is by starting to use them in public transit fleets. So we've done this around the country and around the world. We work with all AV providers who want to work with us. And so we partner with them to provide these on-demand services, and our software enables that routing component. So we're working in places like Arlington, Texas, where VIA has an entire transit network that's on demand that we're operating with the city. And in a portion of the city, a few square miles near the University of Texas at Arlington, we are operating with May Mobility Vehicles, an on-demand AV service, which is pretty awesome and exciting to have that small transit service within a service. So if you order on the app, on the Via Arlington app, you're asked if you want to ride an autonomous vehicle. We're also doing projects in really interesting weather conditions like Grand Rapids, Minnesota, which is 3 hours north of Minneapolis. That's a really rural area. They have very limited transit, a significant population of wheelchair users, obviously learning a lot about the weather challenges for AVs. So those are just examples of some of the work we're doing around the country. And so in terms of data, because we are working with public entities, we provide a significant amount of data. A lot of this is focused on ensuring that these public transit services are serving the purpose, the goals of the transit agency. So if they're doing first and last mile service versus filling a transit desert, are they able to succeed at these goals, or do we need to make adjustments? So we provide a lot of aggregated data focused on service. So looking at things like heat maps to see where folks are going and where they're not going. There's a significant amount of data that we provide every day in real time that agencies have access to, but then others where we sort of meet and share data. But this and some of our partners, because these are funded by federal, state, and local dollars, they are required, as Matt mentioned, to provide a significant amount of data to government. So we help them with that data. For example, at the federal level, if you're receiving formula funding, you have to provide data to the National Transit Database. So that's an example, and it requires a lot of collaboration among a lot of folks. So there is a significant amount of transparency because these are public funds and these are public transit partnerships. And that's, kind of important to our company as well to make sure we are providing all of that information.
Thanks, Aparna. And Jeremy, I want to ask you a similar question, given the type of work that you do. What Haas is doing involves a lot of unique interaction with government and end users. Can you speak a little bit about that collaboration and what kind of data sharing goes into the Haas Alert system?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure a number of you are not familiar with Haas Alert. So we're about a 6-7-year-old company that actually started after one of our co-founders almost got struck and killed by an ambulance going through an intersection at the same time. And he, everything was okay with him from that incident, but he started to go down this path of, well, let me FOIA cities to get access to their real-time emergency vehicle data. And, city after city told him that we don't have it at all. And he didn't believe him. He kept pushing. And, after a while, he's like, okay, they really must not have this data right now. So we actually exist to not solve a technology problem, but to solve a data problem by creating real-time dynamic hazard data for things like emergency vehicles, tow trucks, disabled vehicles, work zones, things that are happening in the real world that are unplanned, that are dynamic, but that require drivers and vehicles to be aware of and do something differently than just keep driving straight. It's a slow down, move over, pull over type of scenario. And the unenviable task that we have is working municipality by municipality, county by county, state by state, with working with their public safety departments, with the DOTs, with the sheriff's offices, to help them understand the safety benefit that we can bring to them and their people who are working in the roadway every day, or keeping our community safer by allowing us to work with them to create new data from their emergency response vehicles or their road crews that are out fixing potholes or doing whatever they're doing for the day. And every single one of these different entities have varying levels of interest and excitement or skepticism about the type of work that we're trying to do and deliver for them. So a fire department, for example, loves the fact that we can help create a digital alert to complement their lights and sirens that they have blaring as they're responding to an emergency. Actually, DC Fire and EMS is one of our larger fleets that we work with today. So almost 200 vehicles are connected to our platform today, where we're delivering real-time safety alerts to people using Waze, Apple Maps, and to 2 million connected vehicles right now across Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, and Ram trucks is our first set of car manufacturers that we're integrated with. But then you get like the law enforcement community who immediately jumps to, well, what are all the bad guys going to do when they all of a sudden can look on a phone and see where we are? And then the transportation agencies, earlier today, Vin White mentioned this work zone data exchange data format that the US DOT spearheaded, which is great to come up with a standard data format, but the quality of the data that we're seeing coming into our system is such that we actually had to turn off the data feeds coming in because the quality level was poor from a couple states. So we were sending alerts to drivers about work zones. There was nothing for miles on the roadway. So it's such an interesting dynamic and spread of challenges that we face. And of course, dealing with the car companies, they want automotive grade quality across the board. So we really have to be stewards of high quality data that's correct, that is meaningful to those individual drivers and those individual vehicles as they're approaching whatever scenario on the roadway.
Thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate that. James, I want to ask you to put your other hat on now. My colleagues talked a lot earlier today about AV laws across the country, and at Neuro, as an autonomous delivery vehicle company, you're subject to those laws. Are some of the requirements in those laws data collection requirements where you have to submit certain information to the government? And can you speak a little bit about that and from the Neuro context?
Sure. Yeah. So my other hat, I run regulatory affairs at Neuro, and as David mentioned, we're building what we call robots. They are smaller, zero occupant vehicles. No human can sit inside. There's no designated seating position, and it's designed strictly to carry goods. And you may have seen a Domino's Pizza commercial a couple of years ago. We work with a variety of partners, and we're growing out our service. And we believe that ultimately it's a safer service. It's a smaller vehicle. It's going to be it's a battery electric vehicle, and of course we're not exposing humans to roadway risk, which is latent. For every mile you drive, there's a risk that you're going to be in a crash. In terms of data collection, so yes, we're subject to a wide variety of data collection requirements. And I'll speak to the two principal ones. One is California, and the second is NHTSA, my old stomping grounds. So starting with NHTSA, so in the summer of 2021, NHTSA issued a standing general order, and they've revised it a couple of times since then. But they characterize it as an investigation into the safety of autonomous technology and the development of autonomous technology. And it requires defined level 4. There's some requirements for ADAS. I'll set that aside for a second. For level 4 manufacturers like us, level 4 autonomy, it requires notification to the agency within a very short period of time if there's been a serious incident. That is to say, a crash involving injury, fatality, that sort of thing. Then there's and serious property damage. Then for lesser incidents, there's a monthly report that you file every month, a month after the incident would have occurred. And that's by and large, some of that is of course you'd expect very reasonable, and it mirrors in large part the EWR requirements that NHTSA already gets from the OEMs. Interestingly, NHTSA put together the EWR requirements through a regulatory process, but they're achieving the same thing through a non-regulatory process with the SGO. But the SGO then, or through the SGO, NHTSA is then publishing this information periodically in very not terribly user-friendly formats in spreadsheets. And so members of the public, any of you can look them up and see how every manufacturer is doing and every incident report that has occurred. There's a variety of detail that's included in there. And of course, any incident that would involve another person, there's potentially PII, personally identifiable information in there. And of course, that NHTSA is doing a good job of redacting that information so that PII is protected before it goes public. Separately, California has a regime where, and of course, California went first here. So if there is a crash, if you're a company that has a permit with California and you are operating on California roads, and Neuro was the first company to receive a driverless permit in California and the first to receive a commercial deployment permit. If you are in a crash, you have to report that to California, and any of you again can go to California DMV's website and you can look up the latest crash reports. They're a series of PDFs and actually relatively easy to use links. You'll see a wide variety of companies, and it actually gives a lot of detail. Of course, there's some redaction that has to occur in there as well because we don't want to reveal details about individual people. But some of these incidents do involve, unfortunately, injuries to people who are either sometimes it's to a third party, somebody's in another car, a pedestrian, a bicyclist. Sometimes it has been where the driver, or sometimes you have a rider inside a vehicle. The rider's been injured. And of course, I should say, when we're talking about what we're calling crashes or incidents, these are not all caused by, this is not a causation question. Many of these incidents occur when the autonomous vehicle is parked at a red light and somebody runs into the rear of them, which is something that maybe many of us have experienced in our lives. Separately, on an annual basis with California, you produce two sets of reports that California then publishes typically around February. One is a list of all the miles you've driven in the state on vehicles that have a permit. So you'll list, and this is for driver and driverless. So you'll list every vehicle by VIN number, they'll redact those, and how many miles each month each vehicle traveled across the year. And then separately, you release what's called the disengagements report. And disengagement means where under the regulation, it's where the autonomy system was disengaged for reasons of safety. It's not terribly clearly defined in the regulation exactly what that means. And clearly, different developers have taken different views of what that means. Some developers have taken a very strict stance to say that anytime their autonomy is disengaged, including when their drivers need to take a restroom break or a lunch break, or at the end of their shift, they're reporting that as a disengagement. So that's, there's a sort of an interesting question there. But you end up with this list of disengagements and then a list of miles. And then the journalists want to pile all that together and put together a list of who's doing what in terms of the track record, how many miles, how many disengagements. And I think the concern that I think many people, including the DMV, have about this data is that it's helpful in some respects, but people are over-indexing on what it actually tells you, because not all miles are created the same. Not all disengagements are created the same. So if you're talking about moving goalposts, different goalposts for every mile, for every disengagement, it really isn't telling you the kind of information you think it's telling you if you just read the report that some newspapers put out, summarizing the latest and greatest. So I think there's some concerns around that sort of data, because I talked before about good data, not good data, not bad data, but not terribly helpful data, right? It could be misleading data. That's bad data, right? Data that sends you down the wrong path. And I think there's a very interesting question that needs to be asked. Well, how are we going to measure the performance of autonomy? The public has a right to know how these systems are performing, because these systems are sharing the road with every one of us, every driver. So you have a right to know what's going on the road, but at the same time, how to package that data in a way that's actually useful and not really misleading is frankly a quandary that nobody has cracked yet. Nobody has solved that problem yet. If anybody has any ideas, let me know. We'll talk to DMV. We'll work it out. But I think and I think that's the next great challenge we have in this space. I mean, beyond of course solving the overall problem, but is how do we track our performance in a way that's digestible to the public? The last thing I'll say on this, and this is a little further afield from what the government is requiring, but there's a lot of interesting discussion in the AV space, or the Secretary of Transportation has recently talked about this. The human metric, right? Well, you want your AVs to be as safe or safer than a human, or 2x safer, or 8x safer than a human being. That sounds really amazing, and of course, that's the goal of every AV company. We're in this business because we want to save lives, because we want to have a safer system. But then there's a very interesting problem here. Even the phrase human metric itself is not, it sounds really good, and we all sort of have a vague sense of what it probably means, but there's no actual concrete definition of what it really means. We don't have good data in that space. We don't have really good data to tell you exactly how humans are performing, not just across the country, but in particular neighborhoods or particular urban environments or particular cities, particular neighborhood. There's a wide variety of ways in which you could define the operational design domain. And how are humans performing in those environments? And then how are AVs performing relative to humans in those environments? Right now, it's a very fluid environment. We're all still trying to figure that one out. Every company, I think every researcher has slightly different definitions. There's some great data out there from Virginia Tech on the SHARP2 data set, which is amazing, but it doesn't get you to the granular level of how do we stack up performance vis-a-vis the city of San Francisco, where so much of the development is going on today. So anyway, I'll stop
No,
there.
that's
With
great,
very
James.
interesting
And
data.
that's where I want to kind of go next. I mean, we talked a lot about the use cases and certainly the rationale behind them, and there's a lot of great reasons for it. But can you each kind of speak a little bit about the challenges? Like, what are the limitations? The data itself might be a limitation, as you said, James, but I imagine in this group is well familiar, privacy considerations, cybersecurity considerations, system incompatibility, Jeremy. Like, what are the challenges that you face when you're dealing with these issues, and how you're interacting with government on this data? Anybody can jump in on that one.
I guess I can start. I could start. So a great example for us recently is in the city of San Francisco, where like literally 2 months ago, I was at the AV and Public Transportation Conference, and the executive director of the San Francisco County Transportation Agency is basically giving the why Hostler pitch. I mean, she's talking about the challenges that their city streets are facing with AVs crashing into first responders, into work zones, and highlighting all the issues. And so I go and have a conversation with her and her department a couple of weeks afterwards, and they say, well, we're not really interested right now in how you can help us. So it's frustrating because there's solutions that are available from private industry. And I know the audience here and the AV companies want to access more information, more data to make their driving safer and better and more efficient. But yet the government agencies, either at the transportation level, or I'm having a similar conversation with the fire chiefs at the San Francisco Fire Department, who are just dragging their feet, but yet complaining about the AV problem that they see in their city. And it's a lot of just finger pointing and stagnation, frankly, that part of why I have so much gray hair is trying to convince these organizations to move forward with viable solutions that can solve not problems that we're articulating, but they themselves are articulating, and we can help address for them.
Is it a concern about taking on innovation? What do you think causes that stagnation?
There's certainly budget issues that they always raise, right? I mean, we're a for-profit company, so we need to charge for what we do. So there's an element of that. I think there's an element also of just going through the procurement processes, sure, and you getting consensus and all the stakeholders on board to move forward with something. The challenge of working with government is to cut through all of that process and red tape to actually bring real solutions to the local communities that ultimately we're trying to help.
Great. Anybody else on challenges?
Sure. I just mentioned, one other thing is thinking about it from the industry and the transit perspective. There's a lot of data being requested. The data that James talked about, there's ride-hail data for ride-hail companies. There's, just a whole host of requirements, and those vary across the federal, state, and local governments. And sometimes that can be a lot. If you're a larger player, obviously you have more resources. And for smaller players, that could sometimes even be a barrier for you to think about going into other states or trying to expand your capabilities. So that, I think, is just one big issue that we have to think about. Like, what is the data being used for? Is it really going to help us gather more information about AVs deploying and just making sure it's possible to streamline some of these processes?
Does that require changing in laws, Aparna?
I mean, potentially, but I think it's still so early on, right? Like each state kind of has their own frameworks, and sometimes the data itself is not the same that you're reporting, right? So maybe it's providing more flexibility in how the data requirements are written into laws and regulations. Thinking about the fact that what people are requiring or what laws are requiring right now might not be useful in 2 or 5 years, right? And so building in some flexibility there might be good as well.
Great. Matt, James?
Yeah, I mean, to echo that, I think it's true. There's a lot of requirements out there, and I think for a lot of those, it's done with the aim of providing something useful. But yes, it's important to keep sort of thinking about, well, if we're going to add more data requirements, other things that are no longer necessary, which is something that we sometimes face, is that you talked about National Transit Database and other data requirements. They're often always just sort of adding to it and not really rethinking, are these things is the data that's being collected useful? Is the data that's being collected even accurate in some ways? There are some things that, agencies don't always have the same definitions of things. So if you're trying to do sort of performance comparisons, it really doesn't create anything useful. So those kind of things, thinking about, how thinking evolves on what exactly you're collecting and how you might shift, not just shift to include more, but shift the sort of window of what you're collecting.
Makes sense. James, anything on that front?
Well, I'll just add that in terms of agencies having sort of path dependence, right, and or inertia, and continuing to collect data long after it's no longer useful. At the federal level, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB, OIRA, their role is to regulate to oversee and enforce the public the Paperwork Reduction Act, the PRA, and it's a very interesting process because in order for an agency to collect information directly from the public, the agency has to put out a variety of notices for comment from the public. It's actually the Paperwork Reduction Act doesn't actually reduce a lot of paper because there's so much paper created in order to do an information collection. But at the end of the process, it's funny because very few people ever comment on a PRA notice and comment. And it would be nice if maybe more people did and made that a more vibrant process, because I do think that that's an area where I think OIRA, it would be up their alley, that's sort of very much in keeping with what OIRA's mission. But also, I think it's beneficial to the public and ultimately the government for the data that's being collected is actually useful, so that the resources we're spending to get there are being spent in a wise way.
David, I just want to add too, for the folks in the room here, especially like the AV companies, I think you've got the opportunity to turn the tables somewhat on the municipalities that you're working with and force them to make data available to you. So instead of them demanding you have to provide more and more information back to the local authorities, you demand that they create the data that you need to make your vehicle operations better, faster, safer, and foster that conversation in a more collaborative way versus you guys having to, you always capitulate to providing more and more information in a very one-way type of fashion. And I think that will start to force the conversation more and force the hand of the local agencies to get more proactive to make that data available.
That makes a lot of sense. What about, you talked about this a little bit, Jeremy, and Brian mentioned this in a previous panel. I imagine law enforcement requests factor in a little bit to what you guys are doing. Like maybe you have cameras out there, right? And you're seeing the environment. Do you get, how do you deal with law enforcement requests? Is that a subpoena process? Is that part of is that a cost of doing business too, as part of your permitting requirements? So I'm just curious about that in that context.
Yeah, most of the work we do with emergency response is more helping them prove that their vehicles were not doing something. Right. Oftentimes they'll get complaints from local community members saying, "Oh, your fire truck was going 50 miles an hour down, a 30-mile-an-hour street," and we'll work with the fire department to help them prove that that wasn't the case. Hopefully, so we haven't fortunately had the reverse happen where we're getting subpoenaed and having to provide data at this point. So it's been very much a beneficial relationship with the public safety agencies.
Aparna, James, do you get those types of requests too?
Well, I imagine most AV companies do. Law enforcement officer sees, responds to an incident and sees that your vehicles are driving around, and all of our vehicles have lots of cameras on them, lots of sensors. And of course, as a company, you always want to cooperate with law enforcement, but you have to go through a process too. You want to make sure that it's done by the book. So and frankly, when I was back in government before I was at DOT, I used to investigate and prosecute market manipulation in the energy markets. And just about every company you'd go to with requesting information that might relate to an investigation you're conducting, they all had what was called a friendly subpoena process. And you go through the process. They wanted to make sure it was a legitimate law enforcement request. And once it's processed through the system, they will comply. And I think that's often a corporate best practice across the board.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time. One last question I'd have for you, and I know this is kind of like the forward-looking question. And we talked about it a little bit. I mean, do you think on the horizon there are policies, legislative changes, things that you think would make this sort of data collection process a little bit easier? James, you talked about maybe amendments to the disengagement process. Is it, Aparna, you talked about the interaction between federal, state, and local. Are there laws that could sort of streamline, make uniform processes? I'm just curious what all of your thoughts about, like, what's the next kind of frontier in mobility data legislation and policy? I know that's the hard question.
Sure. I think part of what we see is that a lot of cities want to get their hands on the information created by a lot of these transportation companies in order to kind of make decisions about what's going on the public streets. And so I think probably the next step for these things in the future is trying to think about sort of what sort of specific kind of standards or things can be created that create that information and that can be built into systems to create that information without sort of requiring that public entities get their hands on a lot of kind of what companies or individuals might consider, proprietary or personal information. Because the reality is that like public agencies don't really want to deal with that.
Sure.
They don't want personal information because they don't want to have to,
safeguard it.
Right. Safeguard it. So I think probably creating those standards to enable that is a great future thought.
And one of the things that we're doing is more at like a federal funding level, trying to legislate digital technologies to be mandated on emergency vehicles, tow trucks, maintenance vehicles, the municipal fleet vehicles, And we've had some success in getting that started with the recent infrastructure bill. About $15 million was appropriated for digital alerting on these types of fleets, but 15 million is kind of a rounding number when you think of the close to 1 million vehicles that are out there that are owned by municipalities around the country. So it's a start, but we're keeping on top of that and hammering that at a federal level to have that kind of spill down effect happen to the local level.
Great. Parna, James.
I think one thing I'd want to mention, this is a bit more overarching, is really thinking about at the federal and state and local level, thinking about AVs and public transit. I think a lot of times AV legislation focused on autonomous vehicles is really focused around, the private ride hailing space or goods delivery or trucking or, personal vehicle ownership in the future. And so really thinking about that public transit use case and how these laws could really further that use case. Because if you think about it, most people, their first time in an autonomous vehicle may be in public transit, right? As we start to integrate them into public transit fleets across the country, especially if you're thinking of someone who cannot afford or access any of the robo-taxi services or private ownership models, this is going to be their first experience. And as many of you know, that public acceptance of AVs is going to be critical for deployment. So getting folks into those vehicles and really making sure laws and regulations are considering that transit use case, I think is important. And then the funding component as well, making sure there's the opportunity for transit agencies and municipalities to access additional funding, because it is very expensive to deploy these vehicles, as many of you know. It's a very cash intensive industry. And so for public transit agencies to deploy these AV partnerships is pretty costly.
Great points. James, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, if I've sounded harsh on the government, I don't mean to be, because I have a lot of friends in government. And, we have to remember that we're in the middle of a revolution in transportation right now. And industry is rapidly developing an entirely new form of transportation. And frankly, it's not just in automobiles, it's aviation, it's across the board. Long term, we're going to be, it's going to be a software-driven world with just different hardware platforms. I think, with that in mind, I think there's a lot of conversation and discussion and learning that has to occur between industry and government going forward, because the government's trying to do the right thing. They're trying to learn about this industry that's developing much more rapidly than government can act. I think there's, this is going, they're taking very good first steps in terms of what data they're collecting. I think we're all going to just continue, hopefully, having a good bilateral conversation back and forth so that the data collection, which should be done, is targeted in the right way overall. And ultimately, I know the government's trying to find what are the things, what is the data we need to collect. So I think that's how, I won't say it's a big policy agenda, but I do think it's going to be a process of negotiation and discussion and learning that's going to occur over the next couple of years and beyond.
Thanks, James. Let me first take care of business. The CLE code word is Lightfoot, after the late, great Gordon Lightfoot. But please join me in thanking all the panelists for being here. I really appreciate your time. Yeah, that's it.
All right, we'll just give us a minute to change over here and we'll move forward. Okay. Thanks for that great panel. We're going to move on to our closing remarks here. And we're pleased at this time to invite up Shoshana Liu, who is the Executive Director for the Colorado Department of Transportation. And Shoshana was appointed the Executive Director in December of 2018 and she's charged with leading the department in planning for and addressing Colorado's transportation needs and overseeing 3,000 employees statewide in an annual budget this year of approximately $2 billion. Prior to coming to Colorado, she served as the Chief Operating Officer for the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. And prior to that, she was the Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs at the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at U.S. DOT. Shoshana has also worked in other areas of the federal government, including the U.S. Department of Interior, the Office of Management and Budget, and Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Prior to her federal service, she worked at the Brookings we don't know. She is a graduate of Harvard College with a bachelor's degree in history and has a master's degree in history from Northwestern University. And, just a quick note on the bachelor's degree in history from Harvard. We were in the same class there. And, it's what's not well known, I think, is that our class was sandwiched between class of 06, just a relatively successful small business owner, Mark Zuckerberg, and class of 04 was current Secretary Pete Buttigieg. So something happened to the class of 05. I don't know what. We're at this forum here, which we're delighted to be at. But with that, let me just invite up Shoshana Liu. We're just so glad to have you here. Thanks.
It's an honor to be here with my fellow members of the Ivy League B List. It's really good to be here today. Quite a group. I think between the folks who have been here throughout the day, we have probably every iteration of Tiger Grant evaluators since the onset of the program, with all the acronyms it's entailed. It's really an exciting kind of coming together of folks as we get more innovative and sort of daring about how we think about transportation. And that also makes it heartening to know that we have good lawyers. I'm getting outside the box here. Really though, like what transportation and mobility are and what the field has become, in the decade or so I've been involved in it, let alone the, one prior and prior to that, is so different than where it started and where the kind of organizations like the one I lead had their origins. I work at a state Department of Transportation. I run Colorado DOT. Previously, the Colorado Department of Highways, like most of them were. And, if you look at the kind of art on the wall at these places, you can tell that they started as places that built and took care of roads, period, end story. The notion that you'd have a room ranging from software experts to auto manufacturers to intellectual property experts debating the kinds of topics that we're talking about today is just not what you would have imagined going into these kinds of buildings, even in our lifetimes, let alone when they started. And I think working in the state part of the sector for 5 or 6 years now, it's been fascinating for me to sort of watch how the kind of more traditional part of the field interfaces with the change that's coming at it. It's really, a different world, and, the sort of evolution from, talking only about concrete and asphalt to still talking about concrete and asphalt, but combined with all of the other things that we have to contend with today is a really fascinating transformation, and one I think we're all privileged to be a part of. And that's exactly why we need to elevate the dialogue about the information we collect, how we use it, and really what questions we're solving for. Because ultimately we get answers to the questions we ask. I suspect there's not much I can add to what the combined brains in this room have to say about data privacy and the mechanics of information collection, except to share the observation that a few years living out west can turn anyone into a libertarian when it comes to healthy suspicion of what the government collects. Like, even I don't like to drive my government car because I'm, don't want the government knowing where I'm going. And don't get the people of Colorado started on red light cameras. They're, Governor Jared Polis has made it very clear the limits of our attempts to expand that space. But from the government perspective, especially with the myriad of challenges that we face on the logistics of data collection, and we joke about the sort of public messaging aspects of trying to pull this together, but that's what you have to do to get information in any space, and it's hard, right? So we have to prioritize what we collect and why. And that's really gets to why we have to, ask the right questions and target the right data points so that we're not just sort of collecting information into an abyss, but really trying to strategically solve for the questions that are most salient to our shared challenges. Now, let me give a couple of examples of sort of how this plays out in the road building space as it emerges into the work that you all do. Traditionally, the models that we have at a place like DOT, look at a few fairly specific metrics. There's some of you will know these storied acronyms, right? Level of safety service, or LOSS. The DOT alumni smile. Basically tells you, given a fairly conventional traffic pattern, when use of fairly traditional single occupancy vehicles will surpass the capacity of a road or an intersection. In the asset management space, we have International Roughness Index and the bridge metrics. I highlight these to talk about sort of the baseline of the kinds of things we collect and what they do and what they don't do. So thinking about first what they do. Do they answer important questions about what we need to take care of the roads we have? Absolutely. You can't make decisions on the projects that we do without them. Do they help us think about what a future-looking set of decisions and kind of conversations would look like about where roads need to go relative to a changing world where people have to kind of be nimble in a society that's changing? Probably not. Or not unless you supplement them with kind of different types of information collection platforms that help us to sort of look at more variables than we're used to looking at when we think about how a project emerges, what the project is, and what we're trying to do with the dollars that we spend. And achieving that broadness of scope, requires a mix of technology. And you've perhaps been in government too long when the thing that got your attention was the sirens on the emergency vehicles. You're speaking my language there. The creativity about how we use the information we do have, and a willingness to try new things. And in the context of government, that probably brings us back to why we need the good lawyers. So just a few examples from sort of the world of state and local government of how I see these things playing out in the conversation. Sort of the technology and how that changes, what we have and what we have to do with it. GPS and open data platforms have fundamentally changed what we know about the roads, but also the day-to-day operational challenges that we face, particularly in expansive networks like Colorado. To give you kind of a example that you should be wary of when you come visit, but you should come visit. When traffic gets really bad on the interstate, the platforms that we all have on our phones will send you over unpaved mountain roads with like one lane in each direction. Beware if it tells you that there's a bypass to Glenwood Canyon. There's not. There is, and none of us, myself included, should drive it. But routinely, people coming to a state that's growing rapidly, get routed onto these places where none of the conventional models that you have in our decision-making matrices tell you those roads exist. But the sort of open data that we all have is changing the way people use infrastructure that was never meant for it. So how do we sort of deal with the fact that we have these real-world challenges? A kind of realpolitik that is looks nothing like our predictive models. That's something we have to grapple with at a speed that's faster than the evolution of the software that we typically use. We can go on about the evolution of the software that we typically use another time. Creativity, right? Sometimes, and this builds on that point, we have to rely on the information we have to figure out what we really need, knowing that there are big gaps and that we have to fill them quickly, often faster than we can. And that, really can help us to formulate those more forward-looking questions. So just another example, during COVID, we used traffic data as a proxy for predicting super spreader events. It worked fairly well for fairly obvious reasons, right? Not a mystery why we had outbreaks in Colorado, Start and Vail. I mean, happened every time. But looking at where people congregate on roads, so to speak, is actually kind of a bigger conversation about where land use is changing, how the movement of our economy is evolving, and where the infrastructure needs are changing, both in terms of the roads and then how we use them. So kind of taking the data that we have available and trying to kind of push it into the formulation of bigger questions about sort of more forward-looking issues doesn't just happen, and it requires us to really probe that data. And that brings me to the final point, which is being a little bit creative about how we leverage data and when we create it and how we sort of think about the sequence between the information we have and the information we want. I spend a lot of time with modelers. Sometimes I joke that I used to be one, but they wouldn't take credit for me. And it tends to be a linear thinking bunch, which I think is mostly a good thing. But sometimes the converse of that is that we wait for data to try things, and we kind of miss the moment for where we actually need to try something new to get the data to sort of figure out where we're going. I would use public transit as an example of where this is coming to a head, right? Not a mystery that public transit use took a big hit during the pandemic, right? I think we've all seen that play out differently in different places, but very severely in some. And public transit is a space where I think the kind of nimbleness of the system is leaves something to be desired. Think about fixed guideways and how long it takes to build them. You understand why. But the convention for how you try a transit service is you wait until you have a predictive model that tells you who's going to use it. In a world where people just stopped using it altogether in a lot of places, Denver is one of them. I mean, the aspirations now are to get back to 70% of pre-pandemic use. If you wait for a model to tell you that people stopped using it during the pandemic and here's where they still are, you're probably not going to save the system. And that's something we've been debating heavily in Colorado. And one of the choices the state made for the services that we run out of the state DOT was to just try some things based on where we knew people were going and see if you can build the demand through changing the supply based on sort of common sense. So, I mentioned previously the super spreader data on the roads. We knew that mountain traffic was off the charts, right? It's been very popular, been a real place where the economy has thrived, but we've seen actually more traffic into the mountains than we had pre-COVID. So we decided that based on where we were seeing the road demand go, we would try putting a new transit service onto the mountain corridor. It's a micro transit shuttle van thing that we did, frankly, without any of the conventional years of planning and modeling and feasibility studies that you would do, and we just did it. A year in, it's 70% full. Which in the world of transit demand these days is, pretty exceptional, right? I mean, that's not where a lot of the routes that have been around forever are. And we actually now have a data point, in terms of where we might grow it in the future. So, we sort of took a risk and just did it based on what other kind of corollary data points were telling us and used some common sense to try something new. So, that's not always possible. It doesn't always work. It, particularly in government, you sometimes don't have that option. But I think if we don't sometimes act ahead of where we have the quantitative data set we want, we miss the opportunity to choose it. So I'll sort of reiterate by stressing that notion that, we get the answers to the questions we ask. And, in a field that's changing, more rapidly than we can, really put our finger on, I think we have to be, incredibly strategic, collaborative, and sort of bring different groups of people with expertise from across different sectors that didn't used to talk to each other together to really make sure that we're collecting information in the service of what we're trying to do. So with that, thank you again for having me. It's really nice to see so many of you, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Okay, I think that concludes our program. So on behalf of Venable, we just wanted to thank our speakers and panelists. I think we'll all agree it was really impressive lineup throughout the day. It was just cool to hear from some of the smartest minds that are thinking about the kind of stream of data that's coming from the evolving mobility norms and technologies that we're all thinking about. Thanks to our audience too for sticking with us for a very long day. We tried to buoy you with caffeine and snacks, and your reward now is that you can have a drink on us. So there's going to be some drinks and snacks right outside where you got your lunch, but let Ariel sort of close out the program. We'll see you next year.
Thanks, Kelly. I'll just make a couple of quick observations. By the way, thanks to Shoshana, I think you redeemed the class of 05. At least for yourself. I still have to call my folks and explain why I did not finish pre-med. So a couple of quick observations that I took down. So for what it's worth, in a very packed day, a lot of information. And from Vin White and USDOT, we were looking at how data can inform actions and how to foster innovation from a government perspective. He talked about the innovation principles that they released and how to translate that into action. From Tyler Duvall and CAVNU, we saw the opportunity to leverage existing data to achieve a number of gains, in particular congestion mitigation, but of course in safety as well. From the first panel, there was a good discussion on how data and privacy are top of mind for the OEMs, AV developers, and rental car companies, all of which are, and our panelists are at the forefront of innovation in this space. I thought it was a good presentation of how they're thinking along those lines. So we appreciate that. Of course, the 50-state discussion on both privacy and on autonomous vehicles. Thanks to Ian and Katie for that. My takeaway is, we talk a lot about the patchwork that's developing, evolving. I think it's more like a ragged quilt being dragged by a toddler. That was my thought, right? It's kind of more than a patchwork, which is a term that we use a little too often now. It's become something that, and the point was made, maybe it's a good thing. Tara mentioned in her panel, maybe there are opportunities there, but there's also a lot of downside. And I think that's what the push for federal legislation is really all about. And then in the second panel, the need for government to sensibly request and leverage data, right? There's so many needs that government has and important opportunities to pursue from a government perspective, but it really needs to be tailored to what the government's or what those objectives are, and not some sort of big data grab. And I think rounding it out with our distinguished closing remarks and our guest from Colorado, I took away the idea. I mean, you're talking about the practical, on the ground implications of how a state DOT is really looking at data. I mean, the movement of people, and I think we tend to get lost a little bit in the technology development. How is a government official really looking to leverage that data in a way that I think really changes people's lives? I mean, if you're trying to go from here to there and the roads are blocked or the roads aren't, needs a new lane, or you need to redeploy transit resources, that's something that really affects the daily life. I think about my commute a lot. So there's just some observations, and we'll take some time now all to end the formal part of the program and get a drink and join the reception. So really grateful for everyone to stick around for joining us, and we'll see you next year at the second annual Mobility Data Law and Policy Summit. So thanks a lot.